Ancient Greece. Rarely do two words fit so seamlessly into a single name and produce so vivid an image in our historical consciousness. This civilization from the north shores of the Mediterranean Sea is credited with many of the innovations in culture and statecraft that have become intrinsic to our modern societies. But as foundational as they would be for everything that came after, my goal today is not to catalog what the ancient Greeks gave us, but to understand them in their own time, on their own terms. Now, in pursuing this line of inquiry, you and I are blessed by the simple fact that the Greeks were ever so slightly full of themselves, so we have an abundance of literature, artifacts, and texts explicitly written for posterity, yo, that's us, which give us insights into high culture, daily life, politics, religion, warfare, and more. Ancient Greece is far from the only historic civilization to keep its proverbial receipts, but some of them tell us what the Greeks thought of their world in striking detail, and some of these receipts look like this! So we're able to see the society with a clarity rarely matched by anywhere in the old BCs. To that end, our story today will trace the creation and descendants of this weird, wacky thing we call ancient Greece, beginning with the origins of civilization in the Aegean Sea during the Bronze Age, then navigating some ouch times to arrive in the half millennium where the Greeks hit their stride. From the 700s to late 300s BC, they were in maximum overdrive, refining their society and expressing the culture that would earn them such lasting acclaim. Of course, the ancient Greeks would not have called themselves that. First of all, because they were quite modern at the time, thank you very much, but also because their name for Greece was Hellas. They were Hellenes, practicing a Hellenic culture and speaking dialects of a language called Elliniki. So come with me on a millennium-spanning journey from the rocky shores of the Aegean to understand what's so exceptional about Hellenism. Let's do some history. Nothing stirs the imagination like an honest-to-goodness mystery. There's just something enthralling about the unknown that ranges from the exciting to the abominably eldritch and incomprehensibly terrifying. Now, our old pals the classical Greeks were no stranger to figuring stuff out, what with all their spiffy philosophy, but there were some things that even they got a little stumped by. Where did our myths come from? Who came before us? Why does that island look like an impact crater? Should we be scared? Well, all these tempting plot threads are wrapped up in the murky history of a pre-Greek civilization called the Minoans. I should specify, not called that by themselves, or even by the Greeks, because this society was so obscure that we only discovered it in 1900. More than just a stepping stone on the road to Greece making it big, the Minoans are a fascinating part of Bronze Age history because they're so darn weird. So, to trace the origins of civilization in the Aegean Sea, let's do some history. It might not come as a surprise to hear that Greece and boats have a long history together, but it turns out that seafaring in Greece is even older than civilization in Greece, as excavations from the Frankthi caves on the mainlands turned up obsidian ferried over from volcanoes on the islands as far back as the Mesolithic era. And those handy-dandy boats helped them make an early transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, as the process involved combining copper with tin, and at the scale the Greeks were making it, those bronze-making supplies were sourced from some hefty mines beyond the Aegean, both to the east and the west. A route that is unfortunately a little too damp for a walking tour. Between that sweet boat access enabling a thriving fishing community and a local agriculture precision optimized for grapes and olives, the Cycladic Islands were looking pretty idyllic for early civilization. I mean, heck, bright sunny islands with seafood, olive oil, and wine? Bronze Age suddenly not sounding too bad. The Aegean Sea will continue being a solid 10 for the next 5,000 years, but after a millennium of bronze making, the cultural center of gravity shifted south to the island of Crete. We can see this quite clearly in the archaeological record because the Cretans had a distinct hobby of building massive palaces. Out of the half dozen spread across the island, the largest and most famous of these is Knossos, home of the legendary King Minos, hence the name Minoan. It was first excavated in the 1900s by Sir Arthur Evans, who stumbled onto some unusually ancient-looking pottery, got curious, bought up a bunch of land, grabbed a shovel, and got to work. Within 5 years, he and his team uncovered a sprawling building complex made of smooth quarried stone with such amenities as skylights, running water, buried sewer lines, and gorgeous frescoes. Clearly no slouch on the aesthetics, but most impressive was the pure scale of the place. The large central courtyard was surrounded by hundreds of rooms for all manner of different purposes, going beyond the typical administrative offices and private residences to include religious spaces, extensive warehouses, artisan workshops, and something approximating a marketplace. Those last three might seem a bit out of place in a royal abode, no matter how ginormous, but they imply a unique structure to the Minoan economy. If the palaces could stock a kingdom's worth of supplies ranging from local Cretan produce kept fresh in cold underground underground ceramics all the way to overseas luxury items, it's likely these compounds served as mass redistribution hubs, taking in everything and doling it back out as needed. Imagine a farmer bringing in jars of olive oil and exchanging it for fish, some wine, and a new cup made by an artisan in the palace. Call me old-fashioned, but I kinda think they nailed it on this one. It's a system that would require immense organization by the governing bureaucracy, but we have extensive tables of what look like storage records, so when it works, it works. Coordination on this monumental of a scale was new to Europe, but it looks as though it took inspiration from the palaces of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. And that's not all they took from the Near East, as the Minoans were stocked with gold, ivory, lapis lazuli, and scarab designs. So even for all the Minoan fanciness at home, they were still fundamentally a maritime culture. And the rest of the Aegean was very well aware of this, as they would have come into frequent and perhaps unwilling contact with their neighbors from Crete. Even without detailed written records, a broad Minoan influence is evident in the mountains of their pottery and goldwork found on the Greek mainland and all the way over to Anatolia. Much of that was spread through trade, but in the Cyclades it was far more direct, like on the miraculously well-preserved island of Thera, which was home to either an indigenous culture that really dug the Minoan vibe, or an outright Minoan colony. This seafaring supremacy approximates something Athens would become famous for 1,000 years down the line: maritime empire. Thucydides says as much when he cites King Minos as the first to have built a great navy, and this makes one key detail of the palaces make a lot more sense. They don't have any walls. The mainland cities of the time had fortifications so thick they were said to be built by giants, but Crete had a 100-mile moat with boats for days, and that was all they needed. That also implies the Minoans weren't a threat to each other and probably worked as one big team. Now, although we can cobble together a decent understanding of macro-scale Minoan civilization from context clues, the details just leave us confused, because there's an incredible volume of art and pottery, sculpture, and beautiful frescoes, but ask 3 historians what on earth it might mean and you'll get 5 uncertain answers, with at least one historian crying. The prevalence of realistic-ish human figures carrying libations and processing clearly has something to do with religion, but beyond that, I don't know. There's also a reverence for the natural world, with particular emphasis on bulls, as stylized horns show up all over the roof of the palace, and one fresco depicts a gymnast leaping over a charging bull. Because sure, parkour is cool and all, but wake me up when the jungle gym starts fighting back. It's metal as hell, but it still doesn't tell us anything without other context. The Minoans did have written languages, but since we don't know how to read either of them, they're stuck as a silent culture, artfully expressing something that we can't figure out. The prevalence of ornately dressed women in Cretan art might suggest a more egalitarian or even matriarchal social order than we're used to seeing in classical Greece, as women take active roles in sacrifice and processions and are sometimes surrounded by male attendants. There's obviously some reason for this, but was it a religious thing, an outright political matriarchy, or blind chance leaving behind more frescoes of women than men? We have absolutely zero idea. Now, coincidentally, we're not alone in our confusion, because the classical Greeks also had no clue what the Minoans were up to. In fact, without modern archaeology, their only indication that there was anything happening on Crete at all in the Bronze Age was from the myth of King Minos and the Minotaur. Red's given the full rundown before, but the salient details are a kingdom with lots of boats, a big old labyrinth, and a terrifying bull monster. This fits surprisingly well into the historical reality of a maritime empire that built complex palaces and was obsessed with bulls. But the later Greeks wouldn't have known that, because Minoan civilization was long dead and buried by the time Athens started loudly bragging about their hometown hero Theseus slaying the Minotaur. So if the Minoans were so big and tough, why didn't they stick around? The most dramatic theory attributes their decline to the island of Thera, which used to be an oval until 1628 BC, when a volcano blew it to bits and sank into the sea, throwing a giant cloud of ash across the southeast Aegean. This does explain why the Minoan site on the island is preserved with positively Pompeian precision, and it left an absolutely gorgeous landscape for tourists to enjoy when they go visit Santorini, but it doesn't explain the Minoan collapse, as it's 2 centuries ahead of schedule. Plato likely drew on the distant memory of this explosion when he dreamed up the story of Atlantis, but it isn't our culprit. So let's go over what we do know about the Minoan chronology and see what we can figure out. The first palaces appeared sometime in the 1900s BC, with sites at Knossos, Phaistos, Zakros, Malia, Galatas, and Kydonia. After an earthquake in about 1700, the palaces were rebuilt with some added structural support, and over the next 2 centuries we see Minoan pottery make its way around the Aegean as outposts spring up from Thera to as far north as Gaea. Then, around 1450, there's a break. Most of the palaces are destroyed, with Knossos surviving for another century before it's abandoned. abandoned. Before 1450, records were kept in a language we call Linear A, which, strictly speaking, is not Greek. It's something else, but we don't know what, and that's why it's still undeciphered. Now, after 1450, the writing is in the same script, but recorded different spoken language. The script is called Linear B, the language is an early form of Greek, and the other place we see this script appear is on the mainland, as written by a people called the Mycenaeans. These guys are relative latecomers, but they're best known as the Achaeans of the Iliad who supposedly fought the Trojan War. So what are they doing on Crete? As it happened, they were in a lot of places, as an artistic survey of pottery in the 1300s BC shows the geometric Mycenaean style appearing all over the Minoans' old stomping grounds. So one way or another, it would seem like the Mycenaeans rolled up to Crete in the mid-1400s and either destroyed or deposed the Minoans, only to leave a century later. Without the palaces there to keep society running as it had been for the past several centuries, the entire civilization simply fizzled out and went back to local fishing and subsistence farming. Now, the wildest part is that the Athenians and the other classical Greeks actually knew about this, they just didn't realize it. The thing with the story of Theseus and the Minotaur is that it lets on more than it seems, because when we peer behind all the mythological window dressing, what we're left with is the distant, imprecise memory of the Minoan invasion of Crete. Not quite a bull monster, but tons of bovine art. Not quite an underground labyrinth, but a puzzlingly intricate palace complex. Not quite an annual tribute of 7 Athenian sacrifices, but... well, here's the thing. The Minoan outpost at Caia is within literal line of sight from the Athenian Cape Sunion where King Aegeus threw himself into the sea, and excavations on Crete turned up startling evidence of both human sacrifice and cannibalism. Mycenaean Athens may well have been a tributary to the Minoan Maritime Empire, and that's a fancy way to say a victim of constant piracy. If Athens has an ancient myth about sailing to Crete and killing a big awful bull monster to liberate themselves from tyranny, that's not very far off from the actual invasion of Mycenaean Greeks in the mid-1400s. So far more than local prince kills giant monster version 18b, the myth of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth is an account of an actual historical event that's been run through half a millennium of mythological telephone. And that, in my professional opinion, is sick as hell. It's some big-time irony that a civilization whose words nobody else can read is best known through a story that nobody thought was real. Modern archaeologists can ponder the Minoans with the aid of incredible discoveries to try and understand what was going on in this stunningly vibrant culture, but the Greeks that came after the Bronze Age, who had infinitely less to go on, were just as captivated by them. The pure mystery of the palace without a voice and the monster in the labyrinth is so damn compelling. It is impressive how many seemingly fundamental aspects of Greek history trace back to the time before it was even Greek history. Terrifying. I love it. Imagine the surprise of classical historians in the 1870s to discover that the ancient city of Troy was real. Before then, everyone assumed it was as mythical and non-existent as Atlantis, just a story dreamt up by that Homer guy as an object lesson about the perils of spousal kidnapping. But what do you know, when an archaeologist wanders around the western coast of Anatolia and starts digging roughly where Homer said the city was, one might happen to discover a Troy or two, or in this case 9, as Mr. Heinrich Schliemann found 9 distinct layers of urban settlement, stretching back from the late Stone Age into the Bronze Age and down through the Roman Empire. That same decade, Schliemann applied this winning strategy on the Greek mainland to find the home of King Agamemnon and, of course, take all his stuff. Not that he was still using it, nor deserved to keep it, but motives aside, sure enough, Homer's descriptions led to the fabled site of Mycenae rich in gold, whereupon Heinrich discovered a metric ass-ton of golden treasures and artifacts. Among them, a solid gold death mask that Schliemann oh so dramatically insisted was Agamemnon's, which is like digging up a Guy Fawkes mask and proclaiming that's American icon George Washington, because who else would it be? But this is also the same eccentric gentleman who swiftly developed a reputation for peppering his dig sites with outside relics and straight-up forgeries to tie his findings to the Homeric heroes. In spite of his shifty habits, it turns out the findings were far more consequential than just a face mask of the suckiest character in the epic cycle. Because modern archaeology dates the treasure trove to 1600 BC, 4 centuries before the supposed time of the Trojan War. And when taking the discoveries at Troy and Mycenae together, we find out that there was a broad, long-lasting, and robust Bronze Age civilization in the Aegean a full millennium before Greece's classical period. So, to find out what this Mycenaean civilization was like and understand why it disappeared, let's do some history. As with all sufficiently ancient civilizations, Mycenaean origins are murky and unknowable, but as best we can guess, some Indo-Europeans crossed over from Anatolia into the Greek peninsula sometime around 2000 BC and either joined or subjugated the native population, and the lasting outcome of that collision was an early form of the Greek language. Granted, it took this shiny new civilization a while to get going, as we don't see the society come into full form until the mid-millennium, when Schliemann's beloved palace cities start popping up by the hundreds, from the Peloponnese to Thessaly. The 1500s BC also see the construction of bling-filled shaft tombs and grave circles right outside the cities. Echoing the Egyptians, albeit on a much smaller scale, the Mycenaeans made a point to bury their VIPs with truly obscene amounts of wealth. Weapons, precious stones from Far East, and goldwork in a distinctly Minoan style. So while this directly shows how the Mycenaeans were active participants in the expansive Mediterranean trade networks of the time, their aesthetic choices might also indicate a power dynamic with the mysterious Minoan civilization from the island of Crete. Now, unlike the mainlanders, the Minoans did not speak Greek, and as a result we have only the loosest, most disappointingly flimsy grasp on their culture. But they had a killer aesthetic, and the Mycenaeans didn't need a translator to figure that out, so the mainland Greek palaces took heavy influence from their Cretan neighbors, in their pottery, their mural work, and in their architecture. Because much as the labyrinthine palaces of Crete served functions from administration to religion to manufacturing, commerce, and food storage, the mainland palaces were similarly designed to handle all these tasks. This Minoan influence kept up all throughout the Bronze Age, but the Mycenaean palaces had a distinct character to them because of a little thing called monarchy. This is first evident in the elaborate burials of the 16 and 1500s BC, where only someone of such singular importance could justify throwing all that wealth in the ground. And we don't see that on Crete. And the Mycenaean concept of royalty is confirmed by the word wanox appearing in Mycenaean ledgers, which is what Homer calls the Achaean kings. Then, when the palaces really take shape 2 centuries later, their central feature is a megaron, a cozy throne room with splendid frescoes all around and a giant hearth in the center, along with huge banquet rooms like we hear about from Homer, channeling that Minoan grandeur on a much more compact scale. The palaces topped out at 100 rooms max, and the Greek mainland had so many of them that it seems each Mycenaean king had a little pocket-sized realm to call their own. The Palace of Nestor at Pylos was one of many Mycenaean sites nestled among the mountains of the mainland, looking out over a valley and down toward the sea. Most Mycenaean kings only ruled what was in line of sight, making them much smaller fish than the Minoan Palace of Knossos, which seemed to rule the entire island of Crete. As we'll see throughout Greek history, the land is so thick with mountains that any one city will naturally struggle to hold power across a long distance. So smaller domains per kingdom make sense when the geography itself is figuratively and literally balkanized. And this might go a ways to explaining why the Mycenaeans were so frantically militaristic. Their art is all about hunting and warfare. They buried kings with prized weapons and kept huge armories in their palaces. So whether they were constantly fighting each other for gold or taking their talents to the mercenary business for the Minoans, there's clearly more to this than empty macho vibes, because the Mycenaeans perceived enough of a threat lurking behind the hills and off the coast to take some drastic measures. By the 1200s BC, the terrain and their military must have stopped being sufficient for protection because major cities surrounded themselves with truly colossal walls of giant stones stacked up over 50 feet high and sometimes nearly as thick. Later, Greeks attributed these massive fortifications to the giant cyclopes, but terrified humans could also do the job in a pinch. Whatever it was that got them so spooked, it was so bad that Mycenae and nearby Tiryns took the extra step of fortifying the cisterns, presumably to ensure their water supplies could withstand a siege. Inconsiderate neighbors, I tell you, they play music until 3 a.m., they steal the buried treasures of your ancestral kings, and they poison your water supply. So selfish. That said, the builders at Mycenae weren't too busy quaking with terror at the unknown to show off a little, and took the Cyclopean walls as an opportunity to flex with the centerpiece Lion Gate leading into the city, featuring a giant heraldic sculpture that would have been completely unmatched in the Aegean. Yet, the broader trend was much the same as it had been earlier, with most of the fancy new construction going to use underground, as dozens of cities built beehive-shaped tholos tombs for their last few generations of kings. So we've got a steady embellishment of mainland cities right alongside increasingly dangerous neighbors, and the Mycenaeans were right to be wary of each other because Greeks had a habit of destroying civilizations. See, back a century and a half in the mid-1400s BC, the Minoan palaces on Crete got slammed into the Shadow Realm so hard that their entire society spontaneously disintegrated. A rough way to start the week. But the exception was the main palace at Knossos, which stayed in use for one more century and conveniently left us some written records before its abandonment. The tablets use the same linear A script the Minoans used for centuries, but now recorded the Mycenaean spoken language of Greek. Before long, long, this linear B was found on tablets all across the mainland, implying that, one way or another, Crete had been destroyed and the Mycenaean Greeks were gleefully benefiting from it. A most curious coincidence. This century after the Cretan conquest and before the Cyclopean fortifications saw the Greeks hit their stride by drawing on Cretan writing, visual aesthetics, and palace structure, ultimately resembling the deified Minoans here in the 1300s more than they ever had before. And it's from their adoption of Cretan writing that we get a glimpse of Mycenaean religion. While most of the clay tablets left behind are warehouse logs, armory tallies, and other admin stuff, we can clearly spot some familiar names, like Poseidao, Atana, Ade, and Dionyso. The gang's not all here yet, no Aphrodite or Hades to speak of, but we can see nearly all 12 Olympians even this far back. One oddball quirk here is that it seems Poseidon was the big boy deity, not just at sea, but also on land and possibly in the underworld, since Hades had no known mentions at this point and likely came later. Very weird, very cool, and while I am definitely not the myth guy, we can use these stories we know to clarify one particularly pesky part of the history: the collapse. Records left by the Hittites and Egyptians in the 13 and 1200s mention the great kings of Ahiyawa, referring to the lands of Achaia where the Mycenaeans lived. But just 2 centuries later, the Hittites were gone, the Egyptians were struggling, and Greek writing was forgotten after all those fortified Mycenaean palaces were abandoned. Alright gang, get your conspiracy boards, because theories to explain this bizarrely widespread cross-Mediterranean collapse range from climate change to internal upheaval to earthquakes to inter-palace warfare, but we've seen busted palaces get a makeover and stay in use post-collapse. That's why Troy has 9 layers, so the question is not so much why they died, but why they stayed dead, and this is where the myths might help us. For example, the sudden death of Minoan Crete could be adequately explained by invasion, but we can pull a far more compelling thread by considering how the myth of the Minotaur fits in. As spoils of Minoan piracy taken to a maze-like palace with bull aesthetics becomes ritual sacrifice to the monster in the labyrinth, and an Athenian hero's daring victory in Crete reflects the actual Mycenaean conquest of the island. Likewise, the Mycenaeans' rabid militarism and massive fortifications on their palaces would be costly to maintain, indicating that whatever threat they were facing had them so scared the cost didn't matter to them. And archaeology shows that Troy was a large, wealthy city between the Greek and Hittite worlds, guarding the trade routes into the Black Sea. If resources got scarce because of drought or famine somewhere, or if new trade routes bypassed Greece, or there was too much piracy for goods to flow, or just because the Mycenaeans spent all their cash on walls and weapons, competition in the already militant Mycenaean civilization would intensify, and Troy, with its favorable location and vast wealth, would surely be a coveted prize. But even a mild disruption to the city, let alone a sack, would wildly destabilize the regional trade that kept Bronze Age societies running. Aha! We're getting somewhere. Now, looking at the Greeks' own tale of the Trojan War and peeling off the mythical embellishments, we see a giant conflict that ended in the total sacking of Troy and the deaths of several Greek hero kings. Realistic explanations of the Trojan War play up the angle of a fight over trade routes, but taken all together, we get something like piracy against the single richest city in the Aegean world at a time when the flows of wealth that supported a massive warrior class were rapidly drying up, resulting in the martial power of the Mycenaean warrior elite spending its last dying effort on trying to conquer Troy in the hopes that their pirated wealth would stave off the collapse of their civilization. But failing, because sure, Troy gets got, but look what happens after. Very few heroes make it home back alive, and Odysseus had to fight off hordes of suitors once he finally did a decade later. All the Trojan gold in the world won't help if every palace is in a succession crisis. So it's possible the epic stories retold over centuries are the distant, imprecise memories of a doomed military expedition to Troy, and the potential cause of a mass power vacuum that leads to the chaos we see in the archaeological record. First, the more vulnerable palaces start falling in the 1200s, then Troy has a burn lair at 1180 BC, Pylos burns that same year, and just a couple years later, Egypt's pharaoh Ramses III has to fight off the suspiciously Greek-sounding Equish and Denyen sailing down from the north. This indicates a broad migration of Greeks and others fleeing the wreckage of the Aegean for safer ground, resulting in oddities like Peloponnesian Greek spoken in Cyprus and Mycenaean pottery in Palestine. Whatever happened in the 1200s to set things in motion, Troy was the tipping point of a widespread collapse of Bronze Age civilization. Whoops. And that is roughly how the Mycenaean Greeks turned on themselves and took down everybody along with them, leaving Greece without writing or large urban centers for centuries after, but with one hell of a story about the time they destroyed the fucking world. What does it look like when a civilization collapses? For my part, I hope to never know from experience, but we can indulge this morbid curiosity by looking into ancient history where few societies imploded quite so spectacularly as the Mycenaean world of the Greek Bronze Age. Yet even if we presume that mega-scale piracy and a war in Troy figured into it somehow, the process of collapse for Greece's interconnected palace ecosystem is clouded in the smoke and rubble of its own downfall. Still, in the end, it sure as hell broke. Palaces lay abandoned, trade had evaporated, the population shrank, writing was forgotten, and it took nearly half a millennium before the Greeks re-emerged from the ensuing Dark Age. Now, that's a bit of a dodgy term, and historians will die for their terminology, so while the modern interpretation emphasizes the loss of writing as the darkness rather than making any value judgment, we can better understand this point in history not as the absence of something, but as the drafting table for what will become the most fundamental concepts of Greek civilization going forward. To see how, let's do some history. By the traditional reckoning, the stone-built citadel of Mycenae falls in 1177 BC, and within a century and change, all but 40 of the 300-plus settlements across Greece fall off the map, while the use of bronze for tools and finery likewise disappears. The island of Crete in the Mycenaean heartland of the Peloponnese had it the worst, and with pirates just off the coast, no city walls for protection, and no economy to support dense urban settlement, the survivors of the collapse went to the safest logical space: away. So while the urban population utterly collapses down to less than a tenth, the overall populace had only halved. Yet, for those survivors, we can imagine their feelings by picturing the view from down the hills and reflecting on the once magnificent palaces of their ancestors lying empty as a shell. It's not just that life was hard, it used to be better. The greatest Mycenaean citadel suffered the hardest of falls, and many would never be inhabited again, but the periphery up north had a softer landing. A hilltop citadel on the Attica Peninsula might never have been abandoned and would remain in use as it became the Athenian Acropolis. Plot twist. Further out on the island of Evia, we find the rare site of new stone construction, a small palace-like estate with the remains of a cremated king, his wife, and horses seemingly done to emulate the heroic burials recounted in the Trojan War. Surprisingly, this grave does hold some bronze work, but it's vastly outnumbered by goods made of iron. And this illustrates one of the period's big riddles. How did the Bronze Age upgrade to the Iron Age if all of civilization went kaplooey? It seems incongruous, but it made perfect sense to the Greeks because, to them, iron was a downgrade, merely a product of cruel necessity. The two chemical components for bronze were mostly sourced outside of the Aegean, with copper from Cyprus and tin as far as England, but when the trade routes dried up after the collapse, bronze making got way the hell harder. However, iron ore was naturally occurring beneath most of mainland Greece. The technique came from Cyprus and was likely introduced in the 1000s BC at bustling spots like Lefkandi, but it soon became widespread. We can appreciate that iron's a harder material, but the Greeks thought it was too much of a pain in the ass to smelt for how much uglier it was than bronze. To be fair, correct. Contrary to our darling March of Progress, the 8th century poet Hesiod coined the entire concept of the Iron Age to bitterly lament the decline from the heroic glories of bronze to the backbreaking labor that iron represents. But even if iron was a scrub metal for idiot losers, its prevalence does show us that Greeks were slowly coalescing into large enough groups to mine, smelt, and make use of the stuff. In the immediate wake of the fall, the basic group unit was the oikos, a family with the head of household, immediate relatives, slaves, and any retainers who attached themselves to the oikos for protection. A far cry from Mycenaean royalties, but it was fit for purpose. Over the centuries, they grew into villages, then towns, and by the 8 to 700s, cities. And it's here that we can finally speak of the polis, an urban center surrounded by supportive farmland and dozens of smaller villages, which will become the definitive unit of Greek society. We translate the concept as a city-state, but it's the combination of city and land that creates 1,000 self-sufficient polis across Greece. Your Spartas, your Athenses, and countless others whose arrival marks the turn from the Dark Age into the Polis Age, where Greece as we recognize it comes into form. However, I'm getting ahead of myself because this shift took hundreds of years, and that notable slowness owed in part to how hard Greece can actually be to live in. Every tiny valley beneath the mountains could accommodate some herdspeople, but larger communities may rapidly find themselves outstripping what that land provides. This started causing trouble around the 800s, so the Greeks employed 3 new strategies. First was to conquer your neighbors by force and take their land, that'll be Sparta's MO. Second was to trade with those new Phoenician merchants to sell what you have and buy what you need, that's the Athens strat, and third was to send some of your people out to make a new town on some distant coastal island and collaborate at a distance. This was originally the Evia strategy, but it'd soon be an everyone strategy. And all this movement brought the Greeks into closer and more frequent contact with those seafaring Phoenicians. Merchants though they were, their biggest gift to Greek civilization was not goods, but writing. Because some curious Greek in the late 800s saw a Phoenician marking down trade logs and figured they could use those same characters to write Greek. Of course, the languages aren't one-to-one, so the big swerve was taking the Phoenician characters Greek didn't have sounds for and instead making them represent vowels. Now, this easy list of 20-odd shapes could convey everything imaginable with no ambiguity and let ideas traverse both distance and time. The uses were immediately apparent, not just for ledgers, laws, and inscriptions, but poetry. And from the very first scraps of text, it all seems like the #1 poetic focus was the Trojan War, as it was possibly the single biggest event in Mycenaean history. That said, it's pretty damn impressive that Polis-era Greeks even knew it had happened. For those stories to survive the loss of writing and the aforementioned total destruction of urban society, etc., etc., the original tales from Bronze Age poets needed to pass through an unbroken oral tradition, dispersed across the Aegean and preserved through generations of families in quotes, fragments, and episodes. No small task. That storytelling chain inspired the heroic burial at Lefkandi and survived until long-distance trade re-emerged, letting storytellers start comparing notes. The tale of the Trojan War was far too vast for one poet to recount in a night, so the Greeks told it in a series of episodes within a broader epic cycle. So, with the advent of writing, it became possible to take several smaller stories, dozens even, and codify them into one cohesive megawork, or in this case, two, because the late 8th century graces us with the Iliad and the Odyssey. We ascribe these to the legendary poet Homer, but whomever he may have been, the stories as we have them are the product of thousands of oral storytellers and scribes working together over hundreds of years. And you can hear that pan-Hellenic collaboration in the poems, combining elements from every Greek dialect and simultaneously including details only a Polis Age poet would have seen with things only a Bronze Age story could remember. Spooky. Both stories at once show the harshness of war and piracy as well as the glories of the heroic past, and that perspective really only makes sense coming from a small family looking down on a hill onto that broken palace of their ancestors. The subtle yet pervasive melancholy of these poems is the voice of every Dark Age poet that carried that story from Mycenae to Homer. And if we are to speak of a single poet, Homer, his great innovation was combining the episodes into character dramas for Achilles and Odysseus. All the mythological embellishments prevented from serving as any strict chronicle, but the values and deeds of the epic heroes become guiding moral principles for a shared Greek identity. The epics aren't a sacred text, but rather the main ideological statements of what Greeks should be. And on a meta level, they define this new society. If you can read the epics in Greek, then you are Greek. So by the 700s, Greeks have local political unity within the polis and a broader cultural unity through language and the epics. And this spirit of communal individuality drives the Greek love of competition, flexing your excellence in pursuit of glory, and that heroic swagger manifests in athletic competition. In 776 BC, the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia hosts the very first Olympic Games. And in true heroic style, Olympic victors would be immortalized in poetry. It's all the spirit of epic heroism. So as we enter the Polis Age, we see some elements of continuity back from the Bronze Age. The spoken Greek language, the pantheon of gods, memories of Troy on fire. But in the time between the loss and rediscovery of writing, Greece was transforming into a land of city-states, all inspired by the heroic glories in their shared epics. Gotta say, composing the core essence of all Greek civilization is not bad for a Dark Age. Now go read the Iliad. When the Greek world awoke from its 4th century power nap of the so-called Dark Ages, it did so under a brand new configuration. Brushing the metaphorical sand from its eyes and drowsily looking around the Aegean Sea, we can imagine our personified civilization startling itself to attention, astonished by the scope of the changes to their ancient abode. Gone were the great palaces and mighty kings of the Bronze Age, long since dead and buried under the cataclysmic weight of a civilization-scale collapse, hence that lengthy nap, and here to replace that was the city, known in Greek as the polis. The turn of the 700s BC saw the rise of dozens and soon hundreds of these small independent city-states, comprising an urban center and its surrounding countryside, each of which had their own laws, government structures, and local customs, but all of whom were inseparably part of a wider Greek civilization that was coming into full form. The question we're after today is, what did that civilization do? What did it look like, act like, believe in, aspire to? What made ancient Greece ancient Greece? Okay, that was several questions, but they all connect, I promise. As we'll see over the next 2 odd centuries, this ascending era of Greek society is defined by a spirit of collective individuality, and that is represented most vividly in the polis. It's the definitive unit of society and the lens through which Greeks understood themselves and interacted with each other. History calls this stretch from the mid-700s down to 500 BC the Archaic period to distinguish it from the lofty classical era and Athens' golden age, but I see it as Greece's age of cities, the polis era. So, to learn how it shaped every aspect and layer of Greek civilization, let's do some history. This arrangement of independent states bound by a common culture is best described by Plato as frogs around a pond. In this case, being a frog means speaking a version of the Greek language, worshipping the Olympian gods, and participating in these civic societies. Now, we might assume he's describing the OG mainland around the Aegean Sea, but he's actually reaching from Gibraltar to the far edge of the Black Sea, as Greeks carved out hundreds of polis in Sicily and southern Italy, Anatolia and Cyprus, the North African coast, and the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. That's a big pond with a lot of frogs. Across this very wide board, every polis was the unique product of a land, its people, and their customs. That meant each wrote its own laws, had a preferred patron deity, and organized their own government. Most of the time, this took shape as oligarchies governed by a handful of aristocrats, but every polis had different systems of councils, assemblies, and head honchos. Sparta famously had twin dynasties of kings running the state with the help of 2 additional councils, and while Athens would later invent a little something called Demokratia in 508, it was one of countless cities to have a brush with tyranny. That word conjures up images of vicious autocrats, but the original word tyrannos simply refers to someone who girl-bossed their way to supreme power without being elected to it. It's a purely neutral word, and in practice, many notable tyranni in the Archaic period were law-abiding, benevolent, reformist leaders who left their polis a lot better than they found it, like the Kypsela dynasty of Corinthian tyranni, who turned the city into a key economic hub in Greece. Now, among the greatest threats a city could face was stasis, the factional discord within a city ranging from shenanigans in the assembly between rival oligarchs to full-on civil wars. Cities could get very familiar with bouts of stasis erupting from normal polis life, then giving way to a tyrannos who rallied enough support to consolidate power and quiet everything down before eventually returning to normal. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't fun, but that was a cost citizens paid time and time again to preserve their near-sacred civic autonomy. In a civilization where no single polis was preeminent above the rest, and each fiercely guarded its independence, competitions between cities were as critical as the internal ones, and even seemingly simple intercity disputes over land or local resources became essential conflicts for survival. When states were this small and this close together, any neighbor behind the mountain, in the next valley over, or further down the coast was a rival and a threat, and handling that threat meant being prepared to cut a fool. This, of course, is the domain of Ares and Athena, warfare. Now, the precise method of ancient Greek stabby times was once thought by scholars and enthusiasts alike, whoops, to be an organized, sport-like affair where 2 tightly packed formations of soldiers pushed against each other's shields in an attempt to break the enemy line, whereupon it was GG and everyone went home. More recent scholarship, like last decade and change recent, has convincingly disproven that model by reinterpreting key evidence and pursuing new and better supported logic. This is a fascinating instance where historians are working right now on developing a new model of Polis Age warfare. The gist is that it was a brawl in bronze, and the big innovations in technique, tactics, and macro-scale strategy came into form during the later classical era, then were perfected up in Macedonia by some twink named Alex. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and military history is a little overrated anyway, so what can it tell us culturally about the Greeks? Essentially, every core feature of early Greek warfare derived from and reinforced the polis system. See, these warriors are best known for their kit and their formation, marching into battle with a giant hoplon shield massed in a phalanx. Here, rich and poorer citizens marched side by side and depended on each other to not catch a spear to the ribs. This was not a professional army funded by the state, but a citizen militia where every hoplite bought their own gear. They were soldiers one day, back to being a farmer the next, but always a citizen. And fulfilling their responsibilities in war earned them civic rights in the polis. The theory of a hoplite revolution links an expanding citizen pool with a growing hoplite army. The old aristocrats shared political power with the lower classes in exchange for their vital contribution to the city's defense. Ancient Greek politics was a full-contact activity. There was, however, another main venue for competition, one that Greeks took just as seriously as killing each other, and that was sports. Yeah, actually that tracks. These are the guys who'll burn down a city over a chariot race. We can't be that surprised. Starting in 776 BC, the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia held festival games every 4 years. Athletes came from all over the Greek world to prove their excellence in running in chariot races, throwing stuff, and different styles of fighting, from wrestling to the all-out pankration, which literally means all the power. That's cool. That's a cool name. Set against the collective action of hoplite warfare, these athletic festivals awarded individual glory, elevating Olympic victors into modern-day Homeric heroes, celebrated in poetry and lavished with honors by their home city. In time, those cities began competing with each other vicariously through their star athletes, but in the Polis Age, this festival celebrated a purely individual excellence. The Olympic Games were such a central fixture of the culture that the 4-year Olympiad was the closest thing to a standard calendar across the Greek world. Every city had its own means of timekeeping, but say the start of the classical period at 500 BC always maps to the first year of the 69th Olympiad. Nice. As the games were a religious festival at their heart, the event was protected by a sacred truce, a month on either side of the festival days allowing athletes and spectators to make their way to and from Olympia with no threat of shenanigans. Any ongoing wars between cities couldn't interfere with trans-Hellenic travel out of respect for the sport and the tacit divine threat against defiling Zeus's big party. And this all makes it abundantly clear what the Greeks prioritized. Warfare, politics, and culture coexisted day to day, but when one had to take precedence, religious observance was it. The historian Herodotus quotes the poet Pindar to say, "Nomos opanton vasilevs," culture is king of all. And yeah, I'd say that's accurate here. The Olympics were one of 4 pan-Hellenic games, meaning they were open to and celebrated by all of the Greeks. The other 3 were the Nemean, Isthmian, and Pythian games. That last one was held at the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, known by myth as the center of the universe and home to Apollo's divine oracle. The authoritative voice of the god of prophecy himself, the oracle advised on everything from personal life to the course of empires, counseling on where to create new settlements and, in Athens' case, what to do when the Persians were invading, trusting one of the most consequential policy decisions in their history to Apollo's supposedly hash-blasted interpreter. This power was clearly invaluable to the Greeks, so Delphi was undoubtedly the most essential pan-Hellenic site in the Greek world. That, of course, earned it some gifts. First were small offerings left by individual travelers, then valuable gold tripods from richer patrons, and toward the very end of the Polis Age, the cities themselves got in on the action, building lavish treasuries on the sacred road to the sanctuary just to house the gifts from their citizens. What started as an act of pure piety, where better gifts earned more divine favor, became a competition for prestige. Delphi was a truly neutral venue, protected by a sacred truce of several major cities, Helen of Troy style, and as such it was the most prominent viewing gallery for civic flexing. If each individual polis was a distinct insular pocket of Greek society, the pan-Hellenic religious sanctuaries like Delphi and Olympia were the key forums for a collective expression of Greekness. And that's really the balance here. For all this aura of competition, everyone was performing the same culture, speaking the same core language, and creating in the same artistic tradition. Red and black pottery with stylized figures, naturalistic sculptures, gorgeously proportioned temples in that quintessentially Greek fashion. Here too, there's a balance between capturing the beauties of nature's variety and respecting the underlying mathematical order that governs the universe. Ideas that would later come to define Greek philosophy were already being expressed through artwork. So in art, religion, athletics, warfare, and civics, we're seeing different iterations of the relationship between the individual and the collective. How they contrast, yet how they're deeply intertwined. People commune in cities. Those cities then commune as a civilization. Each polis connects the individual to the whole and simultaneously has elements of both of them. Its existence facilitates ancient Greek culture and so ultimately defines it. That determines what it meant to be Greek in this society. The original word politiki doesn't just refer to government but describes the affairs of the polis in all the different venues we've seen. Politics in ancient Greece is an art of performance and competition, so participating in that collective individuality through the city is the essence of Greekness. It's either that or the cool looking helmets, 50-50. No matter the place, the people, or the period in time, no culture is a monolith. Every society contains multitudes within itself, as each language has dialects and all art styles have variations. No 2 hands paint a vase the same way, no 2 poets tell quite the same story. Now that's hardly groundbreaking analysis, but it puts us in the frame of mind to answer some far trickier questions. Namely, when does a culture stop being that culture? How do we decide who gets included in the history of a civilization? And what does it look like at the periphery? The logical reflex is to find an anchor point, usually a culture's origin or exemplary biggest boy, and work outward from there. And this frequently works, but as cultures spread across distance and evolve across time, it gets harder to find a solid place, person, or period that can serve as our anchor, and as a result, our periphery can get real fuzzy. So in my grand quest to paint the history of capital G Greece, we'd be remiss to not explore that outer boundary, learn what makes it special, and understand how it fits into the civilization at large. And that line of inquiry brings us to Cyprus, a delightfully saucepan-shaped island in the eastern Mediterranean well outside the Aegean basin we most closely associate with Greece. Now in the context of Greek history, Cyprus is, quite simply, weird as all hell, because in comparison to the Aegean gang 500 miles northwest, Cyprus is running on a parallel track and at points looks like it's running the complete opposite direction. Now what the hell does that mean? Well, guess we better do some history. Starting at the start, the name Cyprus, or Kypros in Greek, has a contested etymology, first name dropped in Mycenaean Linear B as Kupirio back in the 1400s BC in reference to either the Greek word for cypress tree or a translation of a local Cypriot word for copper. Whichever the origin, Cyprus started mining copper in the 4th millennium BC and boomed in the latter Bronze Age as it exported the stuff as far as the Aegean and Egypt. And supplying 90% of the material for bronze earned the island some surprising renown, as Egyptian documents from the 1300s record several conversations between the pharaoh and a Cypriot king where the two address each other as brother, which would be an exceedingly bold overstep if the two were not on very comfortable terms. The letters themselves are honestly hilarious. In one of them, Cyprus effectively says, "Greetings, brother. We will definitely send you the rest of the copper we promised you. There's just a teensy plague going on, so please don't freak out. We pinky promise the copper is on its way. Just give us a minute. Also, could you send us some silver?" Take notes, Ea Nasir, that's how you handle supply chain problems. There are some other fun letters between Egypt and this kingdom they called Alashia, and the rest of the Near East seems to have known Cyprus by that same name, as it's attested across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Mycenaean Greece. Now, speaking of all these cool civilizations that definitely lasted forever and all had 8-packs, one of the Bronze Age's most distinctive features is the part around 1200 BC where it collapsed, but Cyprus didn't quite experience it the same way. Namely, while the Greek world completely lost writing in the 1100s after all their kingdoms imploded, Cypriots fully retained their writing system and just skipped the defining attribute of the Greek Dark Ages. But even wilder is the language itself, because rather than an alphabet, Cyprus had a syllabary where each sign maps to a syllable sound. The Mycenaean Linear B worked the same way, but here's the eldritch kicker: Cypriot writing predates Linear B by at least a century, meaning it's more likely derived from the Linear A used by the Minoans, who spoke a language other than Greek we still cannot translate. The Cypriot syllabary then represents an unbroken linguistic chain from the Minoan Bronze Age through to the Hellenistic era, and one that was only deciphered from a bilingual inscription written in Cypriot and Phoenician dating to 338 BC. With the script deciphered, we can see that the syllabary was used for 2 different languages, scattered evidence of a native Cypriot language we can't understand, and much more abundant writings in a dialect of Greek. On the one hand, hooray, we can snoop on all their diaries, but language also reveals who these Cypriots were. Here's the setup. The Mycenaeans spoke a particular dialect of Greek that largely vanished after their collapse, replaced by Ionic, Doric, and Aeolic by the start of the Polis Age. But it did not disappear entirely, and its closest cousins existed in 2 places, the inland mountains of Arcadia and Cyprus. This dialect, called Arcado-Cypriot, stayed remarkably consistent across written records, suggesting the Mycenaean presence post-collapse was not as aggressively jostled as everywhere else. Now pair all this with folk traditions from 6 Cypriot cities claiming lineage from heroes of the Trojan War. If we put on our big bronze thinking helmets, that all squares quite nicely. An existing population of Mycenaean Greeks was happily writing their language in the Cypriot syllabary during the Bronze Age. Then, after the collapse, a second wave of Mycenaeans fled the burning palaces of the mainland to find refuge on the island, giving rise to several legends of Trojan hero parentage. Instead of calamity, Cyprus flourished. Society was clearly organized well enough to keep writing stuff. New cities were founded with claims of heroic ancestry, and the cities of Kition and Ankomi built Mycenaean-style cyclopean walls with ginormous slabs of stone. A total inverse of the narrative in the Aegean. Absolutely bonkers. Fast forward a few centuries, and when the mainland Greeks wake up from their Dark Age nap, Cyprus had 10 odd states spread across the island, in a curious blending of Mycenaean kingdoms and the new civic-minded polis system. That's best illustrated by a tablet from 478 BC detailing a gift of land to a family of doctors as given by, quote, King Stasichipros and the city, the Idalians. That's the king and his citizens co-signing a contract. Compared to the rest of Greece, that's really weird and really cool. There's no civic relationship relationship quite like that anywhere else. Once again, Cyprus breaks all the rules. The exact who's who of the city kingdoms varied over the centuries, with sources listing slightly different names each time. All but a couple cities post-Bronze Age were majority Greek, with Amathus having more native Cypriot population and Kition home to and ruled by Phoenicians from Tyre. And such contact with the Near East brought Cyprus its number one deity, with the goddess Astarte arriving from Phoenicia to become the Greek Aphrodite. Cypriot myth claims their island as the spot she first stepped out of the ocean, in an elegant little reflection of history in the myth itself. So we can see that Cyprus isn't just Greece but far away, it's got a lot going on internally as well as how it interacts with the rest of the Med. Admittedly, not always on Cyprus's terms, as the Archaic and Classical periods are a revolving door of imperial hegemonies. Assyria in the late 700s and 600s, Egypt for a spell in the mid 500s, and Persia from the late 500s up until Macedon rolls up in the 330s. As far as sources indicate, Cyprus paid its tributes and was largely allowed to operate autonomously, even minting its own coinage under Persia. The kings of Cyprus actually invited Persia in, likely on the logic of, they're gonna get us, so we might as well get in on good terms. But a few decades later, at least one Cypriot had second thoughts. When Ionia revolted against Persia, Onesilos of Salamis saw an opportunity and rallied the cities in 497. Amathus chose not to participate in this narrative, and Kurion's backstabbing got Onesilos killed in battle, so Persia regained control, but the island remained rowdy for the next century and a half. Athens briefly campaigned in Cyprus in 450, and in the 380s, Evagoras of Salamis united most of the island in a push for independence, away from Persia and towards Greece. Then, at the end of that century, Cyprus got what they were after. Mostly. In 333, Alexander the Gamer Strats routed Persia in the Battle of Issus, so the kings lent their navies to support the siege of Tyre and close out the Mediterranean campaign. Good stuff. The downside is that our pal Big Al died, and his Macedonian generals fought viciously over the island until Ptolemy claimed it for good. Once again, no dice on independence, but with the arrival of Alexander the Convenient Endpoint, Cyprus was culturally and now politically in the heart of the Greek world. Cyprus still has plenty going on in the Hellenistic era and beyond to Rome and the Byzantines, including some really gorgeous archaeological gems like theaters, tombs, and mosaics, but at this point it's firmly in the same track, running parallel with the rest of Greek history, no longer defined by its place on the periphery. The kings were ousted and replaced by a governor who ruled Cyprus as any other province, but most emblematic of all was the switch from the Cypriot syllabary to the standard Greek alphabet. We can imagine Macedon showing up to say, "Holy actual hell, what in Gaia's green earth are you writing? Cut that out, just use the letters! Ugh, Zeus above!" So ancient Cyprus is as distinct a part of the Greek world as history could possibly allow, an almost mirror image of the Aegean made all the more fascinating by its place in the wider Mediterranean. Cyprus is not just more Greece, it is way the hell weirder than that and way cooler for it. Here's a question designed to trick you. Where is Greece? Now it seems obvious. Too obvious. I'm showing it to you right now. It's where the country called Greece is. Big peninsula, smaller peninsula, bunch of islands, too easy. I even labeled it. But hold on a minute, that right there is the modern state, but there's also ancient Greece, and those things don't necessarily overlap. This is why you should never trust a rhetorical question. It's a ploy by Big Thesis designed to introduce a topic. However, today I am Big Thesis. It is me, and the point I'm making is that the defined geography of modern Greece skews our perception of ancient Greece, subconsciously omitting the parts which don't line up. Modern Greece is a mainland surrounded by islands, while the ancient Greek world is better understood as a circle of land surrounding the Aegean Sea, and that includes the east coast of this ginormous peninsula named Anatolia. The word in Greek simply means east, as it marks the place where the sun rises, and while it's indeed a bit to the right of the mythological center of the universe at Delphi, the Anatolian coast is not just an essential piece of the ancient Greek world, it's also where most of the cool stuff came from. Art, architecture, literature, philosophy, and more were pioneered on these eastern shores before being imported across the Aegean for latecomers like Athens to fiddle around with. Boom, Athens slander, I gotta get it where I can. So, what's so neat about this slice of land, and why did its place in Greek history get so muddled? Well, nothing to do but do some history. Now, Anatolia is a large place with over a dozen major regions and plenty of peoples calling it home over the centuries, but our story will focus in on three coastal areas, Aeolis, Ionia, and Thoris. Beyond being stacked adorably on top of each other like kids in a trench coat, these names tell us what kinds of Greeks lived there, because ancient Greeks didn't consider themselves one unified ethnicity, but grouped themselves mainly by dialect, and the three big ones were Aeolic, Ionic, and Doric. Ah, pattern. Now, written records don't really tell us how Greeks first populated Anatolia. The best we get are post hoc founding myths concocted centuries afterwards. But if we compare those with the tribe's linguistic distribution and notice the cleanly mirrored placement across the Aegean, we can intuit a gradual migration of Greeks across the sea, starting possibly in the late Mycenaean era but picking up after the Bronze Age collapse, with the end result by the 700s BC being a constellation of Greek cities along the Anatolian coast. Aeolis and Ionia each had a 12-city dodecapolis, and Doris rounded out the squad with a 6-city hexapolis. In contrast to the purpose-built colonies established in southern Italy during the Polis Age, these cities developed right alongside those of the mainland, arising slowly and organically, sometimes over top of pre-existing Bronze Age settlements. And that was the case with the Mycenaean-era citadel of Milawanda, abandoned in the Dark Ages and later repopulated during the migrations. In the 700s-500s, this city, known as Miletus or Miletos, had grown to become the premier polis of Ionia, of Anatolia, and possibly all of Greece. Miletus profited handsomely from trade with the seafaring Phoenicians and amassed a huge population to send out for its own colonies, founding as many as 90 all around the Black Sea and as far south as Egypt. The Milesians sent their people everywhere, but also brought the whole Mediterranean to them, to visit the great sanctuary of Apollo at Didyma just outside Miletus. Similar to sites like Delphi and Olympia, the sanctuary attracted votive gifts from all over, becoming an open-air showcase of art and craftsmanship from Greece, Phoenicia, Egypt, and Assyria. And those eastern works heavily influenced the development of Greek art. But also, down in the Nile River colony of Nafkratis, Greeks got an up-close view of monumental Egyptian statues, taking that inspiration for the immense scale and stylized figures of their own kudos statues back home. They also would have been awed by the enormity of Egyptian architecture, potentially accelerating Greece's evolution from wooden temples towards their iconic stone temples. And back in Ionia, the Ionic order, with its fancy scrolled columns and elegant running frieze, was pioneered at the great sanctuary of Hera at nearby Samos, and peaking slightly ahead of the 4 Greek wonders of the ancient world, 3 will be in Anatolia. These were big evolutions, but all this eastern contact shaped art and material culture on smaller and domestic scales as well, from textiles to roof tiles to pottery styles. The Greeks would take all these ideas in their own new directions as centuries unfolded, but most of the raw artistic inspiration, the spark, came from the east through Anatolia. But if the arts were a clear case of reception into innovation, something new and unique to Greece was emerging in literature. The eastern island of Chios was home to the legendary poet Homer, who probably took the sprawling oral tradition of epic poetry and stitched it into the stories we know as the Iliad and Odyssey. Right out the gate, infinity poetry points to the Ionians. They win. They simply win. But one island north and a century later, the Aeolic poets Alcaeus and Sappho of Lesbos were at the forefront of a new style called lyric poetry, where the poet speaks not as a faceless vessel for the muses, but as a defined individual with experiences, opinions, and, in Sappho's case, a to-do list. Then, around 600 BC, a new kind of thought took shape on the coast. Not declarative, like poetry, but inquisitive, as Thales of Miletus sought to understand the nature and origins of the world through natural phenomena rather than divine ones. His fields of study were what we'd today call science, mathematics, and astronomy, but the core process of questions, deductions, and reasoning that Thales pioneered would spread, grow, and take shape as philosophy. During this formative pre-Socratic period between Thales and when Socrates kicks down the door to ruin everyone's day, Ionia remains squarely at the forefront of philosophy, producing thinkers like Anaximander, Heraclitus, Pythagoras the geometry and triangles guy, and significantly many more. But the Ionians weren't done, as the underlying ideas of philosophy spread in new directions, and that quest for understanding took shape as 2 new fields, geography and history. Thales and Anaximander had pondered the full shape and size of the earth, then Hecataeus of Miletus did the work to fully catalog the known world in his Periodos Ys, the journey around the earth, starting from Gibraltar and Iberia and going clockwise around the Mediterranean to the north coast of Morocco. And last but likely most famous of all was Herodotus of Halicarnassus, whose book The Histories unified storytelling with geography to take the reader on a tour of the world across lands and through time. For all Herodotus' inaccuracies and outright nonsense, his skill was in stepping outside of his political and cultural perspective to present the most vivid picture of the ancient world yet seen through a mostly objective viewpoint. Per his own words, the book is an inquiry, drawing a line back to the inquiries of Thales. Science, philosophy, and history are very different things now, but they sprang from a cohesive Ionian thought process. Now, the Eastern Greeks of Anatolia did not have a monopoly on culture, but similar to how we might think of Athens as the cultural beacon of the classical era, Anatolia, and Ionia in particular, were similarly the beacon, the center of gravity, in the Archaic Age. These Greeks produced the most innovative artisans and most renowned poets of their day, and set the model for how to think deeply and reason across several developing fields. One lens to understand the cultural accomplishments of the later classical period is that the mainland finally caught up. I'm joking, a little bit, but only a little bit. But here's the problem. With all the above being true, why is this not the main narrative of the Archaic period? Why are the 7 to 500s typically treated as just the setup to the good stuff, and why do the Ionians and co get only a cursory recognition in all this? The reflex answer is to blame Athens for sucking all the air out of the room, but there's something more complicated going on here, because for all that Anatolia did in the Greek world, it didn't stay in the Greek world, and we learn about all this from our buddy Herodotus in the form of the Persian Wars. See, in 546 BC, the Greek-adjacent kingdom of Lydia, just a ways inland, got conquered by the big new power on the peninsula, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And by the end of the century, the whole Aegean coast was under the dominion of the great King Darius. Now, standard Persian procedure kept imperial rule relatively light and local culture intact, but the trade was Persia installing tyrants to govern the cities. In 499, a combination of general Ionian discontent and a local flashpoint in Miletus spread to a full-scale revolt. Fun in theory, painful in practice, and the end result was Persia violently reasserting its authority by destroying Miletus, razing the city, and enslaving whomever they didn't kill. One of the greatest Greek cities was in ruins, and Ionia got the unfortunate status of problem corner of the empire. All this, in turn, precipitates the Persian Wars against mainland Greece and the subsequent rise of the even more exploitative Athenian Empire. These are essential pillars of Hellenic history in which the Eastern Greeks are mere bit players subjugated by other people's empires, passing from Persian, Athenian, Persian again, until Alexander the Jumpscare flips the table and redraws the entire world. In the ensuing Hellenistic era and into the Age of Rome, Anatolia saw a spectacular reemergence with magnificent cities like Pergamon and Ephesus, but two things had also changed. After Persia rolled in, there was always a bigger center of cultural gravity. Sardis, Athens, Alexandria, Rome, Constantinople, Athens again but modern this time, Ionia never again had the same prominence as in the Archaic period. But the second change is that Persia inadvertently initiated the classical period by severing Anatolia from the rest of the Aegean Greek world. So the fundamental idea of classical Greece, so focused on Athens and Sparta, exists in a kind of opposition to the East, and thus to Ionia. That era became the iconic chapter of ancient Greek history, yet it just so happens to be the one which excludes the Eastern Greeks the most. Frustrating, maybe, but once we notice that lens, we can see how it colors the rest of our cultural memory, which in turn becomes an opportunity to understand that history better. That's the job. So, here's a question designed to get you thinking. Where's Greece? Just when you think history can't get any wackier, they go and invent Second Greece. Sure, we have original Greece, the land around the Aegean Sea with your Spartas and Athenses and co. But jump one peninsula to the left and there's an entire ecosystem of cities in the south of Italy, just as culturally Greek as our pals back home, and maybe even a little shinier. In those early centuries before Rome painted the map red and became practically synonymous with Italy, Greeks were among multiple groups calling that peninsula home. But aside from location, the biggest difference between OG Greece and this Greece too is why it exists at all. This region is known to history by the name Magna Graecia, a Latin rendering of the original Megali Hellas, meaning Great Greece, and it was, in a word, colonized. Bit of a loaded term, but it helps us understand what sets it apart and makes it so darn interesting in the classical world. So, to see why the Greeks settled this big old boot and how it grew from nothing to a region worthy of earning that grandiose title, let's do some history. When the first Greek city-states took shape in the 800s BC, there were nearly zero of them outside the Aegean basin. However, the Greeks themselves were not so sedentary, as many seafarers traveled across the Mediterranean to trade with Phoenicians, Etruscans, Egyptians, and others. Now, to avoid ending up like Odysseus, ancient sailors liked to stay within sight of land, and that meant seeing a lot of coastline in the course of their travels. Sooner or later, one of those shores will look like an appealing place to beach the ships, count the inventory, and take a nap. So it was in 775 BC, when, just a year after the first recorded Olympics, sailors from the island of Evia picked a comfy-looking bay a short ways south of their friends the Etruscans and founded the trading port of Pithecusae. Despite its humble beginnings, this settlement began a trend that transformed the Mediterranean. If the Greeks could reach beyond the Aegean to build a quaint little way station, they'll inevitably make more, and the next logical step is to found cities. First came the city of Kyme in that very same bay, later expanding to a new city called, well, New City, Neapolis in Greek, known today as Naples. This establishes a trend I like to call, hey wait a minute, that name is Greek. Indeed, from the Black Sea to North Africa to the coast of Iberia, there are several thriving modern cities still sporting a version of their original Greek name. Marseille was originally Massalia, Nice was Nicaea, Empúries was Emporion, and they comprised a network of colonies in the far west which all sprung from a single mother city. As was the case in in the Bay of Naples, trade was a clear motivating factor, but sending out shipfuls of citizens was a complex and risky operation, so what motivated these cities to embark on distant expeditions? Cop-out answer, multiple reasons, all interlocking but balanced uniquely for each circumstance. In some cases, it was a problem born of progress, as the 700s marked the rise of city-states across Greece and the start of the so-called Polis Age. But mainland Greece is a rocky place, with only pockets of good farmland to go around, so cities could only get so big before resources ran thin. Therefore, this period's rapid population growth was a genuine danger, so shipping off batches of citizens to make new settlements was an elegant solution. But sometimes the home city just didn't cut it anymore, like when the people of Thera fled either a famine or a civil war, records are inconclusive, and booked it south for the coast of Libya, founding the city of Cyrene, or Kyrene, in 631. That city in turn founded its own colonies over the following century to create a lovely little pentapolis, a 5-city network spread along the lush plateau. This region, known by the name Kyrenaiki, got fabulously rich exporting a miracle plant called silphium, and they soon boasted a massive temple to Zeus, bigger than the Athenian Parthenon and several decades earlier. These cities were, lest we forget, built from nothing, yet were plenty capable of upstaging their fellow Greeks on the mainland. Now, for lack of a better term, I referred to these cities as colonies, but this was far from the vast overseas dominions of modern Europe or even the imperial grabby hands of classical Athens. Rather than painting the map one big shade of red, this was a pan-Mediterranean ecosystem of multiple cultures sailing, trading, roaming, interacting, and learning from each other. To give a sense of this cultural braiding, the Greeks picked up maritime trade from seeing the Phoenicians do it and also adapted their alphabet. Greeks, in turn, passed their little letters on to the Etruscans, which a few dominoes later resulted in the Latin alphabet. In addition to profit and resource motives, these cultures flourished with each other rather than trying to flatten each other. Let's not glaze it, conflict will play a large part in this ecosystem before long, but there was no mutually exclusive empire building like we might associate with the word colonization. Perhaps a better word for these cities is the Greek one, apikia, literally meaning away from home. Maybe that's ancestral bias, maybe I'm excited I found a new word during the research. In any case, home in this context being the mother city, the metropolis, who sent out those settlers in the first place. From the 7 to 500s or so, each apikia maintained a cultural kinship with their mother city, but operated as a fully autonomous polis with all the independent spirit of a mainland city. Especially true when one apikia had multiple founding cities, sometimes speaking different dialects of Greek. That new civic identity was the thing keeping them together. In 735, one such joint operation between Naxos, Evia, and other Ionians founded the first Greek city in Sicily. Also called Naxos, so points for teamwork if not for novelty. These far-flung cities were plenty new, but no lesser in culture, in purpose, or accomplishment. The individual reasons for their founding varied by time and place: trade opportunity, resource pressure, population management, upstart youth seeking fame as a city founder, and a handy way to offload troublesome factions by yeeting them somewhere else, but the ultimate reason is because they could. In this post-Bronze Age ecosystem, the Greeks and Phoenicians were well-adapted species with almost zero predators. With exceptions for the Etruscans in the north and Egyptians in the south, every coast on the Med was a candidate for beaching a ship and building a city. Then, once they got running, their only threat was the occupational hazard of being Greek, which is perilous but eminently survivable. So in the 7, 6, and 500s, the Greeks founded so many apikias that the total polis count doubled to over 1,000, and nowhere was the settlement so extensive, densely packed, and prosperous as Magna Graecia. Now, given why the Greeks set sail and how it spread their society, what exactly did they do to win southern Italy peak prestige as best Greece since Greece? Well, like we saw back in Kyrene, it rarely stopped at just one apikia. Settlers got a tiny foothold in Italy with Pithecusae. Later that century, they built Kyme, who in turn founded Neapolis, so by the year 600, they had a tidy little operation running from their personal bay, trading with the Oscans and Samnites inland, the Etruscans up north along the coast, and the rest of the Greeks who later rolled in further south. Such as, of literally all people, the Spartans, who ejected an undesirable batch of non-citizens by dumping them on a boat and telling them to figure it out. Yeah, that sounds like them. After consulting the Delphic oracle, they sailed west and founded the city of Taras in 706. Consolation prize to the Spartan rejects, the gulf which gives Italy its delightful high heel shape got named after the Tarentines, Taranto in the modern Italian. But they also did remarkably well for themselves. Their custom-issued coinage crops up all over Magna Graecia, they had among the finest and most prolific pottery on the peninsula, and in the 300s their leading statesman Archytas was best buds with Plato and a possible influence on his concept of the philosopher king. All that, and they got to leave Sparta? Man, the hits keep coming. Taras really lucked out. Meanwhile, across the Gulf, the city of Sybaris was best known for living fast and dying hot. It became so legendarily wealthy from trade, abundant agriculture, and dominion over its neighbors that the word Sybarite became an insult for really expensive hedonism. Just as well that Sybaris founded towns of its own like Poseidonia because it made for a good escape route when Sybaris got sacked and conquered in 510 by their neighbor Croton. Some portion of the citizens stayed in the Gulf to continue their long struggle with Croton, while others booked it up to Poseidonia. In its day, that city was just one of many in Magna Graecia, but we recognize it today as having 3 excellently preserved temples. Built from a mix of local limestone and sandstones, these Doric-style temples to Athena and Hera are but a few of the disproportionate number of temples in southern Italy still standing. Listen, I love the Parthenon, but isn't it cool to see what it looks like when the pediment is still there? Poseidonia also gives us a neat window into the interplay of Greek and native Italian cultures, such as the Etruscan influences in the gorgeously frescoed Tomb of the Diver, and sometime after 400 BC when the Lucanian people conquered the city, the ensuing blend of Lucanian and Greek art as the city continued to thrive under its new rulers. On the other side of that, native Italians took eagerly to Greek culture, like the Elymian people of northwest Sicily, who were not Greek yet built a marvelous Doric temple in their city of Segesta. But the real archaeological treasure of Sicily is the Valley of the Temples outside the southern city of Akragas. Between the nigh miraculous preservation of the Temple of Concordia and the gorgeous countryside surrounding it, this is peak. This is simply f***ing peak. However, tucked away in the very bottom corner of Sicily was the last gem in Magna Graecia's crown, the massive and magnificent city of Syracuse. Founded by Corinthians in 734, the city of Syracuse, as it's known in English, grew strong enough to rival Athens at its imperial peak in the 400s. Might sound like hyperbole if not for the fact that Athens sailed to Sicily in hope of conquering Syracuse in 415, but Syracuse beat Athens' ass so badly it sent them spiraling towards losing a completely separate war. Let there be no doubt, Syracuse had the sauce. Yet, even by Greek standards, it was turbulent to actually live there, as the city was ruled by multiple lines of tyrants from 485 onward, who usurped the citizen government to run things themselves. This began with Gelon, the nearby ruler who conquered Syracuse to install himself as tyrant. Despite this aggressive onboarding, he was remembered fondly by the Syracusans for repelling an attack by Carthage, extending his city's hegemony across Sicily, and for building temples and a theater, but surely less fondly by the countless war prisoners and civilians from nearby cities he enslaved to enact that building program. His successor Hieron was a man of literature, hosting Aeschylus, Pindar, and others at his court, but Hieron was also an Olympic athlete, headlining 3 of Pindar's victory odes. Hieron's successor was deposed within a year and the city returned to a republic-esque government, but a long-term solution this was not, and Syracuse embarked upon the cycle, a nearly 300-year rotation between competent tyrants, incompetent tyrants, republics of alternating competence every other cycle, and repeat. Syracuse remained the top dog in Magna Graecia, but it had gotten fragile, and in the wake of the scuffle with Athens, Carthage carved out a foothold in the west of Sicily, which queued up 2 centuries of near-constant warfare with those western cities, with Carthage itself, and eventually with the Carthaginians' big bad nemesis, Rome. Surprise! It ends really fast. From the Greek perspective, Rome enters the scene in 326 with the conquest of Neapolis. By the start of the 200s BC, north and central Italy had been painted that deep Roman red, and the upstart republic began dabbling in Greek diplomacy. Taras was quite understandably alarmed and enlisted the mercenary services of King Pyrrhus of Epirus to slap the Romans around and make them back off. This had the opposite effect. Rome bested Pyrrhus and conquered the whole south of the boot. The cities retained local autonomy, but Rome was clearly the one in charge now. From Sicily's perspective, there was a giant military power on each side of them. Logical outcome, the Punic Wars. Rome and Carthage fought the first of 3 wars for control of the Mediterranean, but Sicily was the battlefield, and once the war was over, Sicily was Rome's prize. Syracuse alone was allowed to stay independent out of respect for it being very cool, but that was conditional on good behavior, and in the Second Punic War, they team-swapped to Hannibal. Wrong choice, buckos. In 213, Rome besieged Syracuse, fighting through the weapons of their genius local inventor Archimedes, whom they killed, and captured the city the following year. The sack of Syracuse was so violent and the plunder so grand that historian Livy marks it as the beginning of Rome's moral decline. Uh-oh. But with that, Magna Graecia was inexorably on Team Red. forever binding their story to that of Rome. But that is another story for another time. For now, this story was how the Greeks sailed from their homeland to create something quintessentially Greek yet completely new, and rising from nothing to a thriving ecosystem in an astonishingly short time. While we shouldn't pretend that Greece was the only civilization in the Med capable of doing this, no Phoenician erasure in this house, it's worth acknowledging how the cultural foundations of the polis system supported this vast and complex network. Each city was a complete unit of society, yet they all meshed seamlessly with the wider Greek world. The civilization of Magna Graecia was as extraordinary for its roots as it was for its heights. The Romans were right to take notes. Now, before we get into the classical period and the spotlight-hogging exploits of cities like Athens, I want to do something a little different here. See, as a historian, most of my time and effort is spent cataloging the long arcs of civilizations or spotlighting those brief shining moments. Stories with lasting impacts that are fun to tell because they feel so weighty and important. After all, it's not every day that Athens trips into inventing democracy or Sparta fights the Persians at Thermopylae, but that's the thing. It's not every day. Those big achievements stand out precisely for how rare they are. And while characters like them get top billing in all the stories, we can easily forget about everyone else. The hundreds of side characters and thousands of extras who were there the whole time and comprise most of the human experience by volume, but for whatever reason never land in history's spotlight. The people who lived their lives and left the world more or less as they found it, or in rare cases, those who almost hit it big, almost changed everything, almost made history. These stories are inevitably last to be recorded and first to be forgotten, but were constantly playing out in the background of other people's glory. So today I want to spotlight one. Naxos. Wait, who? Yes, Naxos, the largest island in the Cycladic archipelago and perhaps the most vivid example of a history that doesn't really go anywhere. And for that exact reason, I find it fascinating. So, to see what almost happened in little old Naxos, let's do some history. As we'll soon discover, written records about Naxos are thin and sparse, so our most consistent and reliable narrator is going to be the island itself, the material culture left behind thousands of years ago pieced together into a fuller narrative by the hard work of archaeologists. With that in mind, the story of Naxos as we understand it is one big story of marble, and suddenly it makes perfect sense why Blue is talking about Naxos of all places. Dear viewers, I am nothing if not consistent in my aesthetic sensibilities, and my historian's promise to you is that I will never approach this craft with anything but maximum enthusiasm. Today, that means marble. See, Naxos and neighboring Paros were known for their marbles since the very start of the Bronze Age around 3000 BC, as the defining art of the Cycladic culture was marble figure statues in a gorgeously minimalist style. These could look right at home in a modern art gallery, yet they're some of the absolute earliest art in Greece, and they were producing tons of the little guys. Now, to most observers, myself included, marble is marble, and that's certainly good enough for me, but back in the day, Naxian marble was especially prized. All stone has its distinct hues, undertones, contrast veins, and other qualities. In the case of Naxos, the stone was non-porous, which made it sturdier and more weather-resistant over time, but it also had a bright white hue, a faint translucency, and a bit of a sparkle, which all gave it a beautiful sense of depth in the light. But in addition to some of the Greek world's best marble, Naxos also quarried a rock called emery, which was crushed into powder and used as an abrasive to polish stone to a silky smooth shine. So between marble, emery, and material evidence that they were talented sculptors too, Naxos had a lock on the entire stonework industry, from rock to sculpture to polished product. And seeing as marble never went out of style, this would prove valuable to them for millennia. As the largest and most centrally located island in the Cyclades, or Kyklades in Greek, Naxos would have also been in the orbits of the Minoan and Mycenaean culture in the latter Bronze Age. But after the Bronze Age collapse of the 1100s BC, Naxos had the size, placement, and local merchandise production to eventually recover its role as a major player in the Cyclades. Once Greeks got back into the habit of long-distance trade during the Polis Age, Naxos surpassed all other islands in prosperity, according to Herodotus. This is an impressive claim, yet it highlights the core problem we're about to run into with Naxian history. Once we get written sources, Naxos is always a side character, so we only get details as they're relevant to the bigger players. And in the case of that wily Herodotus, he's describing Naxos in 499 BC on the eve of an attempted Persian attack, so the pursuit of good drama might lead him to embellish the Naxians' wealth to boost the narrative stakes. Luckily, we know Herodotus does this all the time, so while we shouldn't trust that Naxos was the wealthiest, we can infer that it was comfortably well off thanks to all that marble. Specifically, at the sanctuary city of Delphi, various cities brought gifts and monuments as demonstrations of their piety and their prestige. And Naxos' contribution in the 560s was a sculpted marble sphinx atop a 12-meter Ionic column right beside the Great Temple of Apollo. A few decades earlier, at the sacred island of Delos, the Naxians had furnished a dozen marble lions for a terrace near the sanctuary. So from two very public displays of wealth, one nearby and one on the mainland, we can verify that Naxos was was indeed rich and prominent, saving ourselves from the existential headache of trusting a pathological exaggerator like Herodotus. There are other snippets about Naxos that crop up across the centuries, from co-founding the first Greek colony in Sicily back in 735 to repelling that invasion by the Persians in 499, which inadvertently led to the Ionian Revolt and by extension the entire Persian Wars, and 3 decades later being the first state in Athens' military alliance to try and leave, only to get besieged by Athens, forcefully demilitarized, and obliged to pay their alliance tribute in gold rather than ships or soldiers because clearly they couldn't be trusted. So we've seen Naxos had one of the longest running and most impressive records of marble working in all of Greece, and as a city-state they were present for some pretty big moments in Hellenic history, but I think there's one episode that captures not only their history, but is likely deeply relatable for hundreds of other cities in ancient Greece. So let's talk about Tyrannos. The year is 546, and Pisistratus finally succeeded in his 3rd attempts to install himself as tyrant of Athens. Ironically, for one-man rule, he had some outside help from fellow aristocrats, and Herodotus name-checks Lygdamus of Naxos as one such guy. The order of operations is a little vague, but Lygdamus provided Naxian soldiers for Pisistratus' power grab, then Piman took the sons of any political rivals who hadn't run off into exile and put them all in baby jail on Naxos, where he installed or reinstalled Lygdamus as its tyrant. This was part of a broader strategy to create a network of like-minded aristocrats across the Aegean who then consolidated power over nearby islands. Athens claimed the sacred island of Delos, Lygdamus muscled in on Paros next door, and their friend and fellow tyrant in Samos had his own campaigns in the eastern Aegean. Around 530 BC, Lygdamus followed his political godfather Pisistratus and embarked on a hefty building program. A little way inland was his temple at Sangri, constructed entirely of gleaming Naxian marble. Notably, for any architecture enthusiasts, Sangri was a very early adopter of the Ionic style with those swirly column capitals. It's unclear how long it lasted before Christianity came by to swap out the program, but it was fully completed and remained in use for several centuries. This, however, cannot be said for the Temple of Apollo. Just north of the main port city, on a tiny islet, Lygdamus devised his crowning project, a massive, magnificent temple built with monolithic blocks of marble. This promised to be a masterpiece accomplishment that would tie the Naxians' millennia-spanning history of marble work with their ascension to political prominence as Athens' right-hand polis, a giant temple befitting a giant ego. That was the idea. But just because the guy in charge has some slick architecture plans does not guarantee history will oblige them, because instead of the biggest temple in the Greek world, Naxos got nothing. Sometime after 530, while construction was still underway, Lygdamus was overthrown by a Spartan army, which I don't believe on principle because no Spartan has ever understood how boats work. I can't believe historians would fall for such an obvious lie. But regardless, the temple was unfinished. Some of its material was reused for a church after Christianity rolled in, and when the Venetians claimed the island in the medieval period, they repurposed most of the stones for their castle above the city. What remains is called the Portara, 3 gigantic marble monoliths that would have been the doorway to a spectacular monument, but instead they're a doorway to nothing but the sea and the sunset. I've seen it in person and the view is breathtaking, a blend of beauty and melancholy that its circumstances make all the more poignant. A picture-perfect depiction of hubris from a moment permanently unfinished, yet ironically one that's lasted far longer than most completed Greek temples. So much pathos from one empty doorway. All the details on Naxos we can glean from primary sources are included purely as scene setting for larger narratives at play. An Athenian tyrant here, a Persian invasion there. The actual downfall of Lygdamus is vague as all hell because it didn't affect the wider story. Any deeper records of it that did exist are long gone because they broadly didn't matter. And I'm struck by how much this kind of story must have been happening all the time. Somebody shows up, thinks they're the next Agamemnon, but the sauce is weak and they flame out before accomplishing their centerpiece project. So their home city simply shrugs and moves on. If Athens and Sparta are Athens and Sparta, the rest of Greece looks a lot like this. A place of culture and meaning and maybe even some standout artistic accomplishment, but voiceless. Sometimes things don't change the course of history. Sometimes they just are the course of history. Naxos might have been about to have their moment in the sun, but right when it seems like the clouds were parting, the wind blew, the clouds closed back up, and 100 miles away, Athens had a sunny day instead, and Naxos would know. They saw it through their front door. All the big cities in ancient Greece had that one special trait to set it apart. Olympia hosted the big games, Delphi had the oracle, Sparta cultivated buff dudes and systematic self-oppression in equal measure, and Athens, most famously of all, had democracy. Yes, Δημοκρατία, the system of government where the people have the power, the glorious start of the Athenian Golden Age, and one of the Greek world's most consequential contributions to human society, basically happened by accident. Now, that's not to say that it was some unintentional mistake they clumsily stumbled into, as hilarious and frankly uncharacteristic characters that would be, but rather the creation of Athenian democracy was a much lengthier and more complex process than the Athenians would have you believe. According to their folk traditions and drinking songs, democracy was born in a single moment of excellence when Harmodios and Aristogiton killed the tyrant Hipparchus, freeing the people of Athens to live as equals under the law forever after. Great work, team, let's get drunk. That's the story they told themselves and the rest of Greece, but luckily for us, we know that the Athenians are sneaky little liars we can't trust for shit. These are the same guys who claim they're so amazing that gods were literally fighting to be their patron. Cool myth? Maybe cool it on the ego. Now, the real story of democracy isn't as glamorous, but is quite illuminating. A winding century-long tale of reforms, civil strife, tyrants, assassins, an invading army, and a little more civil strife leading to the birth of democracy in 508 BC. Hard fought, well earned. It's a story that could have played out anywhere in Greece, yet it only happened in Athens, so we do tragically have to give them some credit. But as we investigate how this unique system of governance arose in dinky old Athens of all places, we'll see that democracy wasn't a gift from the Olympians above, which only the Athenians were big-brained enough to handle, but a logical outcome of careful problem-solving and a few lucky breaks. And as much as I hate to indulge them with more bragging material, Athenian democracy is even more impressive than we often acknowledge. So, to see how those ego-tripping madmen crafted one of the greatest systems in the history of human society, damn, they're good. Let's do some history. Our story begins in the 600s BC, where the city-state of Athens, or Athena, was completely, utterly average. Located on the Attica Peninsula, midway up the Aegean Sea, it was centrally located in the Greek world, but only peripherally important. Here at the start, Athens was a polis like every other, governed by citizens and an aristocratic elite with a flexible, unwritten constitution. One notable feature of Athenian law, typical of the time, was resolving disputes with endless blood feuds, as seen in the entire plot of the Oresteia. This changed in the late 600s when Draco, or Drakon, supposedly gave Athens its first formal law code. It was so famously harsh that it gives us the word draconian, but critically it turned the law from something nebulous and violent into something codified and standardized. Good start. The code soon got some tweaks in 594 when Solon was the city's archon. That meant he was in charge of the assembly for a year, and boy oh boy did he make it count by implementing a heckin' chonky program of economic and social reforms. First was the Sisakthia, the shaking off of burdens, intended to clear up long-standing debts that weighed down society by nixing the land debt and liberating citizens who were stuck in debtors' prisons. This all was paired with reforms to the citizen classes. Previously, who could serve in what role was preset by birth, but Solon now divided the classes by wealth. He came up with a whole scheme to measure how profitable your land was based on how many standardized units of wheat, oil, and wine it produced. That's some video game-ass nonsense right there, but I gotta be honest, if I was an Athenian, I would absolutely be chasing the high score in olive oil. I don't know if that would make me a filthy capitalist or a filthy gamer, and frankly, I don't know which one is worse. Now, separating out government roles by wealth class sounds very undemocratic, and it is, but ditching birthright nobility was a huge step forward, and once participation rights were set by wealth, there was legal regularity, so from there, it's not a huge leap to say, actually, all of these classes can serve in every part of government, and sure enough, that'll be exactly how we land a democracy. But we're not there yet, because after Solon's whirlwind year in power, Athens just couldn't elect a new archon, leading to a few years of literal anarchy. Anarchia, no archon, because Athens was divided between three rival factions, the men of the plain, men of the shore, and men of the hills. For the next half-century, these regional aristocratic cliques had their run of the place, and it seemed like Solon's reforms had only weakened the state. But as with many cities in ancient Greece, civil strife was the perfect opportunity for an enterprising citizen to seize power and become a tyrannos, a tyrant. So it was in 561 when Pisistratos, one of the men of the hills, appeared in the main marketplace all roughed up, claiming to have been attacked. He asked for bodyguards, got them, and embarked upon crime, marching up the Acropolis to try and seize power by force. He was driven out of the city, so a bit of a swing and a miss, but close enough that he was willing to try again. His second attempt was via a marriage alliance, but when that didn't work, he went back to his roots. Obvious lies and goofy bullshit. He found a really tall woman and dressed her up as Athena to ride into town on a chariot and proclaim Pisistratus as rightful ruler of Athens. But hold on a minute, the first source of that story is Herodotus, and I know better than to trust like that. Pisistratus was also said to have defeated his rival factions in battle at Pellene, and I feel like that's the more important item here. But one way or another, in 546, Pisistratus vanquished his opposition and took power as the sole Tyrannos of Athens. So how does this coup-throwing doofus get us any closer to democracy? Frustratingly, he was damn good at his job. See, the unsolved problem after Solon's reforms was how small, pliable, and weak the Athenian state still was. So as our boy Big P consolidates his own power, he's ruling mildly and cleverly, respecting the laws, still holding elections, and building on the reforms that Solon started. In the short term, he quelled the factional crisis, but in the long run, Athens became stronger, richer, and far more prestigious. Now this is a long list. The man was busy. First, he set up courts all across Attica's countryside to give the law more prominence beyond the city center, while improving the city itself with a big public fountain in the Agora and a new temple to Athena on the Acropolis. He financed this in part with money from the silver mines he owned in northern Greece, as well as new state-run mines down in Lavrion. Those will come in real clutch in half a century when it single-handedly funds the navy that beats the Persians. An Athenian coin struck with that silver soon circulated all over the Aegean. They didn't have that cute little owl yet, but they would, and there's no point in any of this without that goofy owl. P-Man also revamped the city's two main celebrations, the Dionysia and the Panathenaea, turning the celebratory games, feasts, plays, and processions from local events into major festivals that drew revelers and athletes from across the Greek world. On the culture front, he commissioned standardized editions of the Iliad and Odyssey to circulate, which happened to be the earliest versions of the texts we have, so that alone was worth throwing the coup. Not really, but like, And with economic and cultural clout came political influence, as Big P made alliances with the tyrants of Naxos and Samos and annexed the sacred island of Delos, giving Athens a little taste of a naval empire in the Aegean Sea. But just an appetizer, banquet to follow. At the start of the century, Athens was any other small Greek city-state, but after Pisistratus, it was more prominent than ever, and the state had more identity, more authority, and more stability after 2 decades of reforms. Pi Guy was a tyrannos to be sure, but the record shows he was not tyrannical. After his death in 527, his 2 sons took charge of the city, and this takes us to our starting tale of Hipparchus getting staboed by Harmodius and Aristogeiton in 514. Yet despite what those rascal Athenians would have you believe, this was not the end of tyranny in Athens, nor the dawn of democracy, but the violent outcome of a very public rejection. See, Hipparchus made kissy faces at Harmodius, but he was already smanging Aristogeiton, and it escalated from there into literal murder during the Panathenaea, after which point his brother Hippias was still ruler of Athens for another 4 years. And it was in that key interval where he really turned tyrannical, jailing, killing, exiling, and enough other dickish behavior that popular memory of the entire Pisistratid family soured into, ew, tyrants, screw those guys. Hippias was such a menace that Athens reimagined entire arcs of its history to fit how much they hated him. So if that didn't do it, how democracy? Well, Hippias was booted from power in 510 by, of literally all people, a Spartan army, interfering on the advice of the Delphic oracle. But with the tyrant gone, Athens slipped right back into old habits of factional slap fights over the power vacuum, this time between Isagoras and Clisthenes. Aigai wanted K-Man banished because of a century-old curse on his family the Alcmaeonids and called the Spartans back in for help, but this time the Athenians told Sparta to get out and take Isagoras with them, leaving Clisthenes the victor. And here, in 508 BC, Clisthenes makes the reforms that finally achieve democracy. His winning strategy seems to have been invent populism. Realizing the citizens of Athens were a much larger social group than the aristocrats, he promised them new rights to align the people into a single mega-faction. First was making all adult male citizens equal participants in government regardless of property class, with specialized positions chosen by random draw for a term of 1 year. He also reorganized the Athenians into 10 tribes, each of which was subdivided into thirds, 1 group in the city, 1 inland, and 1 on the coast, making each tribe the average cross-section of all Attica. It's a little convoluted, but jumbling everything up fully broke the aristocracy's regional power bases. Then, a council of 500 was created to advise the assembly, with each tribe calling 50 of their citizens to serve on it each year. Once you served, you were out for 10 years, so everyone got their turn and nobody gets entrenched in the system. The goal of all this was to spread out the power and align everyone towards Athens as the provider of law and authority, no room for factions. And every aspect of this system reinforced each other. Each tribe is a vertical slice of Athenian society, the state is constantly rotating who's in charge with random lots instead of popularity contests, and all of that power is shared as evenly as possible. This is, frankly, an astonishing system, not just ideologically, but also as practical problem solving. Widening citizens' rights directly limits the power of aristocrats and the danger of their factions. Every citizen was on an even playing field, and the perils of stasis that the Athenians spent a century suffering from now had a far more palatable solution than tyranny. Athenian democracy wasn't magic, it was genius. forged over a long time with a lot of hard work from Cleisthenes all the way back to Draco. From 508, everything that follows in the Athenian story flows from this single moment of transformation, a change that touched every aspect of the Athenian state and every person within it. Politics, warfare, empire, philosophy, theater, the conscious creation of history, and thus my whole last job derives from this hard-fought, radical innovation. And from here, their golden age lay ahead. Athens had not yet become great, not yet terrible, and not yet glorious, but it was now, undeniably and forever, Athens. Ancient Athenian democracy is a fascinating organism. More than simply a political system, their hometown invention of demokratia was a cultural force that reached across literature, theater, and the relationship between citizens, their state, and each other. Because Athens in the 400s BC was a city where people spoke their mind, criticized the powerful, and disagreed about nearly everything. It was raucous in there. Yet for all the power and deep civic value the Athenians placed in the voice of their citizens, they found it essential to have a mechanism by which the people of the city could collectively, democratically instruct someone to just fucking can it. Yes, much like an organism fighting an infection, Athens knew how dangerous a citizen could become if they grew too ambitious or simply too damn annoying. So a small but essential element of their democracy was a process called ostracism. To understand how it functioned and what it accomplished, there's no better case study than the tale of Aristeides the Just. But first, what exactly is ostracism? Well, at a glance, it looks a hell of a lot like exile, where someone is forced to leave their home city, but it's distinct in a few key respects. Regular old exile had been around forever, and most cities used it as a court-ordered sentence for a crime. A century earlier, the tyrant Pisistratos got exiled from Athens twice, but the intended effect was permanent banishment, sometimes confiscating the exilees' stuff on the way out, and sometimes booting their whole family along with them. Implementation went case by case, and it was certainly preferable to a sentence of death or permajail, but still, extremely severe. Ostracism, by contrast, wasn't intended as a punishment, but a release valve. Supposedly conceived by Cleisthenes as part of his democracy reforms in 508 BC, ostracizing someone is a legally binding order to take a proverbial lap. A 10-year lap, but a lap nonetheless, because the point was to go anywhere else, cool off, and ultimately come back to Athens with your property and citizens' rights perfectly intact. Someone's acting like they might want to be a tyrant? Take a lap. Someone gets a little too buddy-buddy with Persia? Take a lap. Someone keeps suggesting really stupid ideas in the assembly? Not a crime, but take a lap. In every case, the citizen had 10 days to get their affairs in order before they bounced, and their family was left to their own devices, with no consequences or social scorn for being associated with the ostracized. 10 years later, the citizen returned to the city, free to resume their life, participate in the assembly, and even hold special offices like Archon or General. But critically, their social clout would have weakened from a decade out of the loop, and enough time had passed since whatever hubbub prompted their ostracism that the matter was long since resolved and they didn't pose a serious threat anymore. And if they did, take another lap, buddy. Unlike exile, which was by design a punitive measure after a crime, ostracism was a preventative measure. The point was to stop a situation before it got dodgy and come out the other side with no hard feelings between the state and the ostracized citizen. But if there wasn't a crime and a court case about it, how did the Athenians decide who to ostracize? Well, the process was remarkably simple. Every year, the citizen assembly held a vote on whether or not to conduct an ostracism. If yes, they held a second vote to decide who. Citizens wrote names on shards of broken pottery, the ancient Greek equivalent of scrap paper. This pottery shard, called an ostrakon, was their ballot, and if a single name amassed more than 6,000 collective ostraka, the number one pick was officially out of here. Notably, if no name cleared that 6,000 threshold, then nobody got the boot, ensuring that only genuine troublemakers with a critical mass of votes had to pack their bags. At every step, this was a remarkably elegant system. Its purpose, activation protocol, voting mechanism, and consequences were very carefully thought out to solve the problem with the lightest touch possible. At the risk of complimenting Athens, this system is legitimately genius, on par with the Republic of Venice electing their ruler with a child-operated bingo ball machine. Rare and esteemed company. Ostracism is a quintessentially democratic mechanism to combat the power of ambitious citizens who posed a danger to the city. Now here's how, in one instance, it quite possibly saved Athens from total destruction. Enter one Aristeides, humble citizen of Athens at the time it became a democracy. In those late 500s and early 400s BC, Aristeides earned a reputation for always doing the right thing, the just thing. Always willing to make the honest, selfless choice, even at great cost to himself, he had a moral compass that garnered centuries of praise from ancient historians. This handful of examples, recounted by the 1st century AD biographer Plutarch, punctuate a career of supreme virtue, earning him the respect of his fellow citizens with the nickname Odikeos, the Just. But praiseworthy he might have been, he was not perfect, and his downfall came from a rivalry with none other than Themistocles, the statesman in general responsible for Athens' naval power. Some sources say the rivalry started when they were boys, others claim it started over a boy. Neither here nor there. Themistocles persuaded the city to build some ships in 493, then a decade later he advocated for massively expanding the Athenian fleet with money from their new silver mines. Aristeides opposed this, seeing the city's power in its citizen hoplites rather than triremes. The city was split between two different strategies for handling Persia, and ultimately two divergent visions of Athens' future. To resolve this, the citizens told Aristeides to take a lap. Sometime between 484 and 482, as this debate raged on, Athens voted to hold an ostracism, and an illiterate man needed help filling out his ostracon. So he asked the nearest person to kindly write Aristeides' name. This curious citizen asked what Aristeides had done to wrong this man, and he replied, nothing. I don't even know him. It just irritates me to hear everyone calling him the Just. Who does that jerk think he is? The stranger, being none other than Aristeides himself, stayed true to his principles and wrote down his own name on the ostracon. And should we have expected anything less? That vote, plus at least 5,999 others, sent him packing for the next 10 years. Among the 12,000 ostraca excavated in Athens, a few surviving shards bear Aristeides' name. Just imagine if this right here was Aristeides' own autograph of doom. God, I love history. This process worked exactly as intended. He committed no crime and suffered no undue misery, even praying to the gods on his way out to keep Athens peaceful so nobody would miss him while he was gone. But he was in the way of Themistocles' naval policy, so the citizens politely told him to can it. Well, except for that one guy, he had other motives. But just as well they did, because with Aristeides out of the way, Themistocles' giant fleet of ships was the exact thing which saved Athens and nearly all of Greece when the Persians rolled back in 3 short years later. Now, getting Mr. Justice to take a lap was only half of the system working as intended, because the citizens collectively decided, hey, Aristeides was an extremely good general at Marathon. Let's bring him back so he can help us not all die, maybe. Good plan? Good plan. So they formally recalled him from ostracism and elected him strategos, serving under the fleet command of Themistocles. Aristeides, for his part, harbored zero ill will, as they both vowed to set aside their differences to support each other as comrades in arms for the good of Athens. And people think the classics are straight. Give me a break. In the ensuing Battle of Salamis, Aristeides landed soldiers on the island of Psytalia to take out a Persian garrison, a small but essential piece of the victory. The following year, he was re-elected strategos to command the Athenian hoplites at the victorious Battle of Plataea. After that, Aristeides helped liberate various Ionian allies who disliked the Spartans so much they instead swore loyalty to Aristeides personally, which set the diplomatic basis for Athens forming their defensive alliance, the Delian League. And he in turn calculated the tribute every allied paid to the treasury based on everyone's natural resources. Athens quadrupled the tributes by the end of the century, but it started far more fairly. Our international man of justice returned from his ostracism to deliver victory after victory after victory for Athens. His recall was as clear a sign of the system working as intended as his originally getting booted, and it saved Athens in the process. If he never took that lap, there very well might not have been a fleet, and Persia steamrolls them. If they ejected him on such punitive terms they couldn't bring him back, Athens would have been down a talented statesman and general when they needed it the absolute most. This whole saga demonstrates the supreme value of cleverly crafted systems as well as inhumanly righteous citizens. Athens' early success as a young democracy was a product of both, acting in the interest of genuine justice. And as much as I deservedly dogpile on them, I do in fact gotta hand it to the Athenians for designing and implementing a process where the citizens can collectively, democratically say, hey man, I hear you, and as a fellow citizen, I respect you, but I'm gonna have to ask you to just shut the hell up and take a lap. Also, can you write your own name on this pottery shard for me? The Acropolis of Athens is, without a doubt, one of the most aesthetically impressive and culturally significant sites in all of world history, but it took me a while to actually appreciate that. See, my mom is Greek and her family was born in Athens, so I've spent nearly every summer of my life in Greece visiting my mom's family in a small town outside the city. This quiet retreat is the kind of trip that grown-ups dream of, yet as a child, it was agonizingly boring, even including our once-yearly trip into Athens proper to scale the Acropolis and see the Parthenon in the blazing summer heat. By the time I was 10 years years old, I'd made the hike several times already, and this picture so elegantly captures how I was absolutely sick of it. An aura of raging exhaustion I dutifully recaptured a decade later to honor the meme. So far from having a hometown bias on the subject, it took me quite a while to actually conclude that Athens equals cool, and after years of studying up, I can now explain in detail why this big old rock is so fascinating. So, to see how the Athenian Acropolis embodies the classical golden age and epitomizes their massively inflated ego, let's do some history. Though Athens is known for the Acropolis, it wasn't alone in having an Acropolis. The Greek word means high city, and they were a standard feature across the classical world. Even as far back as the Bronze Age Mycenaean period, fortified hilltop citadels served as military bases, religious sanctuaries, royal palaces, or all of that and more. As Greece is rather mountainous, there was no shortage of high places to set up shop and get urbanizing. By the dawn of the Polis Age in the 7th century BC, the limestone plateau of the Athenian Acropolis had already been in use for hundreds of years. It sat a decent ways inland from the Saronic Gulf, but it had two handy rivers to the north and south, and one further out to the west, so the early Athenians had the benefits of easy water and good farms, along with the safety of a geologically prefabbed castle. However, this couldn't protect them from everything, as in 480, the armies of the Achaemenid Persian Empire made their second, much more promising attempt to conquer Greece. A decade earlier, Athens rebuffed the invaders at the Battle of Marathon, but this time around, Persia made it all the way into Athens itself, burning the city and destroying everything on the Acropolis. Even though Athens and Sparta did ultimately win the war and kick out Persia for good, the city of Athens remained devastated for the next 3 decades until the statesman Pericles proposed a new building program in 450 BC. By this point, Athens had established a pan-Hellenic alliance of Greek states and then completely exploited it for the benefit of their own glory and wealth, and so far they'd used it to build a giant 30-foot bronze statue of Athena Promachos, whose spear reflected sunlight for miles around like the beacon of a lighthouse. And that already was quite a feat, but of course, this being Athens, they needed more than that. Just to illustrate the scale of the Periclean building program, the entire imperial treasury of Athens and all its tributaries had nearly 10,000 talents of silver in 450 BC. And just one of those 60-pound silver bars paid the crew's wages on a 170-man warship for a month. Now consider that thousands of talents were spent specifically on the Acropolis over the next 20 years, with 2 entire temples added in the decades after. That's coming up on over half the treasury. To be fair to Athens, it was money well spent. Even the entryway was a work of art. The Propylaea Gatehouse on the western slope of the Acropolis marked the barrier between the common space of the city below and the sacred space atop the hill. It was as lavishly decorated as any temple, with dedicated painting galleries in its north and south wings and a pathway leading out to the small temple of Athena Nike overlooking the city from the outer wall. The most imposing feature of the main courtyard was, of course, the ginormous Athena statue staring out over the city, but the religious heart of the Acropolis was the Erechtheion on the north side. Standing on the mythical site of the contest between Athena and Poseidon, it had a mark in the ground said to come from Poseidon's trident, as well as an olive tree said to be descended from Athena's original gift to the city. The asymmetrical shape of the temple accommodates the uneven terrain on this part of the hill while reflecting the split nature of worshipping at this site. Architecturally, this building is best known for the Porch of the Maidens, where the 6 columns are carved into the shape of women, but the real star was the statue inside, an olive wood idol of Athena Polias, the physical embodiment of Athena's divine patronage over the city. As the final stop of the yearly Panathenaic procession in celebration of the city and their goddess, it's clear the Erechtheion was the most religiously significant building in Athens. But it was not the fanciest. That, of course, would be the Parthenon. At the time the largest temple in the Greek world, it was so darn huge that it had to actually account for the optical illusions of straight lines bending down and outwards. As such, every line on the Parthenon is curved and it has no right angles. The Doric columns that surround the building are all widest in the middle and lean slightly inward, while the horizontal lines are all concave. All this subtle weirdness counters the illusions of buckling and sagging and results in a building that looks perfect. Beyond just planning ahead to correct an issue that, again, few Greek temples had ever encountered before because no sane architect dreamed this absurdly big, the raw mathematics required to calculate and maintain a consistent curvature for every surface on this dumbass building are absolute madness. Immaculate proportions aside, the real focus was up above the colonnade, on the metopes, the friezes, and the pediments. The square metopes show scenes of mythological wars like men fighting centaurs as a metaphor for Athens' victory over Persia. Meanwhile, on the inner wall of the building, a continuous frieze shows a ceremonial procession. Opinion differs on what this might be, as scholars traditionally held that this is the Great Panathenaic Procession, an obvious choice, but a newer interpretation is that this is a mythological reference to the procession of King Erechtheus sacrificing sacrificing his daughters to win divine favor for a war. This might support the name of the Parthenon, generally thought to reference Athena Parthenos, the Virgin Athena, but could have also described the maiden daughters of Erechtheus. Which one is it? Who knows? Scholarship is always evolving. But speaking of Athena, the triangular pediments on top depict the two most important scenes in Athena's life, at least as far as Athens was concerned. On the east side, Athena springs forth from the head of Zeus, fully formed and immediately ready for battle, while the west side shows the contest between Athena and Poseidon for the naming of the city. So between the metopes, the pediments, and either interpretation of the frieze, one could be forgiven for seeing the Parthenon not quite as a temple to Athena, but to Athens, especially considering there was no altar in the temple for sacrifices. Rather, the inside chambers were unusually divided, with the west end holding the Delian treasury, considerably thinner after the Parthenon was finished, and the east end devoted solely to a statue of Athena. Like the Promachos statue outside, this one was huge, but instead of bronze, here Athena's skin is made out of ivory, while her dress and armor were solid gold. She's still got her shield and spear, but now she's holding the victory goddess Nike. This chryselephantine statue of Athena Parthenos likely cost 1,000 talents, making it more expensive than the Parthenon itself. In contrast to the uber-sacredness of the Erechtheion, the Parthenon acts more like a votive temple, offered as a gift to Athena in thanks for the glory of Athens. And I dare say it worked. But for all the shininess and splendor on display atop the Acropolis, there's a very critical flip side to consider. We did the napkin math on how expensive the Parthenon was to build, and those silver talents didn't just materialize in the Delian League's treasury. A hefty share of that money was extorted from Athens' allies at exorbitant rates to pile into a collective defense fund, then siphoned off to a secondary location to stuff their architecture budget. While the Parthenon represents the figurative and literal peak of the Athenians' artistic achievement, they built it on a foundation of all their worst, most exploitative traits. And then, as if that weren't enough, there's also this business with the war. See, just 1 year after finishing the Parthenon in 432 BC, Athens would embark on a 3-decade conflict for control of Greece. Not with existential enemy Persia, who was the impetus behind the Delian League in the first place, but their former battle brothers, the Spartans. And this is where our narrative gets a little intricate, because this conflict is kind of the big thing in most tellings of Greek history. This is the Olympics of warfare, the conflict between the most influential Greek cities at the height of their powers. It is also an excellent opportunity to play with our storytelling. See, thus far we've followed a pretty clean linear narrative through the ages, but as we get into an era of more historical documentation and more recorded stuff going on as writers thought, hey, wait a minute, this might be important, the classical period of the 4 and 300s BC leaves us a bit of a conundrum. While we can zoom in further and further into a single city, Greece also became subject to civilization-wide geopolitics, where competition between cities unfolds across the whole Greek world in multi-decade story arcs. So if we really want to understand Athens and its Parthenon building heyday, we need to untangle the immediate circumstances of that big Peloponnesian war against Sparta. Yet, that too fits into a larger storyline, so we're going to look at this century and change from 3 different perspectives, from Athens and Sparta's POVs, and zooming out to see how it reverberated through Greek civilization as a whole. But rather than repeat our chronology 3 times in a row, this is a golden opportunity to unpack the structure of these 2 competing societies, how they function at home, and how they interacted with Greece at large. So dissociate from time and focus on space as we catalog the cities of Athens and Sparta, then pull it together for the through line of the classical period. The most frustrating part of Athenian history is that they are almost as great as they're constantly insisting they are. Athens lacked the ancient prestige of cities like Sparta and Thebes, but their big break came when they single-handedly stopped a Persian invasion at the Battle of Marathon. And by the time they repelled the second invasion, the power had gone right to their heads. With the might of a navy nobody could dream of matching, they turned the Aegean Sea into their personal piggy bank. They tried to do the same thing to Sparta, but 30 years of war and getting their empire confiscated showed Athens the consequences of hubris. Thing is, lots of Greek cities had their day in the sun. What set Athens apart was their ideas about everything. The invention of democracy brought a culture of discussion and investigation into every aspect of Athenian life. Beyond the broadening of politics, literature, theater, philosophy, and art were all deeply invested in the workings of the state, and the resulting inflation of the Athenian ego is apparent in architectural megaworks like the Parthenon. Though Athens failed to conquer the Greek world by force, the victory lay in their culture, which in the long run would turn Athens into a byword for Greece. Greece. The beauty and brilliance of ancient Athens is that Athens was actually only half of the city. A 4-mile walk away from the Acropolis leads down to the port of Piraeus, which connected the otherwise landlocked Athenians to the Aegean Sea. Originally, Piraeus harbored fishers and merchants, but as a result of the Persian Wars, Athens came to rapidly appreciate the port's military applications. The newly established Athenian navy was built and housed in the shipyards of the heavily fortified Piraeus, and the port city itself was connected to Athens by a set of long walls, creating an oddly shaped but strategically invaluable twin city fortress. In the mid-5th century, Piraeus was the maritime springboard for Athens' imperial ambitions across the Aegean Sea. But once they started fighting Sparta, Piraeus and its walls were the sole reason Athens was not immediately destroyed. See, Sparta's plan was burn all the Athenian farmland and starve them out. Normally, this is an instant win, but the long walls ensured that Athens had easy access to their navy and an unbroken line of resupply from their functionally untouchable island network. So the city shrugged off a 30-year siege before Athens finally surrendered. Without the sea, there'd have been no empire, and without Piraeus, there was no sea. For all the glories and strategic min-maxing of Athens and Piraeus, the real heart of Athenian power was at the edge of a cliff almost 30 miles away. At the far southern end of the Attica Peninsula, Cape Sunion was originally a standard religious site, but it took on a much grander role after 483 BC with the discovery of silver mines in the nearby town of Lavrion. Athens used this newfound cash to fund the creation of a fleet, which came in astoundingly clutch during the Second Persian War 3 years later. From there, Sunion's subterranean money printer powered the growth of Athens' navy into a force that would dominate the Aegean Sea. And as far as geography goes, Sunion was ideal. It not only stood guard over the Saronic Gulf and the ports of Piraeus, but it was at the cross of major north-south and east-west sailing routes. So this cape was the perfect vantage point to monitor and control the entire sea. And Athens doubled down on their projection of power by building a magnificent temple to Poseidon atop the cape, in full view of passing ships. This exceptionally unsubtle declaration of maritime dominance is probably the most characteristically Athenian thing that Athens ever did. It's gorgeous, it's petty as hell, and I love it. Now, technically, the Athenian Empire wasn't called an empire, but rather a league of allied city-states who pooled their resources to better defend from future Persian invasions. And this league was based right in the middle of the Aegean Sea at the island of Delos. As the mythical birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, Delos was among the most sacred sites in the Greek world, sporting a massive multi-deity temple complex and drawing pilgrims and merchants from all over. This centrality and pan-Hellenic appeal made it the perfect candidate to host a league of Greek states, or at least pretend to. From its founding in 478, the Delian League organized and paid for the collective defense of the Aegean, accepting tribute in ships, soldiers, or silver. The island's treasury and the Temple of Apollo also paid for various cultural projects like the Delia, a religious festival with games and theater performances. Of course, Athens would later drop the coy facade and openly leverage the pan-Hellenic culture of Delos to promote the glory of Athenian culture. In 454, the Athenians robbed the league without an ounce of remorse by relocating the entire treasury to Athens, later housing it in the Parthenon. The desertion of Delos made it more than clear Athens had stopped pretending they weren't an empire. As far as the Athenian treasury was concerned, money just showed up, but that process was conspicuously inverted for the allied states who had to shell out every year. In the half-century since the founding of the Delian League, cities increasingly realized that funding the Athenian navy was a roundabout way of paying for their own oppression. So the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos hatched a scheme. With Spartan assistance, they'd revolt from Athens and unify the other cities on the island under their leadership. But the Athenian navy was quick on the draw, blockading the island and besieging the cities. Mytilene's hopes for Spartan reinforcements didn't bear out as they arrived only after Mytilene already surrendered. So now the question in the assembly was what to do about all this, and the ensuing Mytilenean debate illustrates the callousness of the Athenian mindset. As punishment, they chose to kill all the men and enslave the women and children. The next day, the assembly snapped out of their bloodlust and decided to only kill some of the men, but they had to change their mind, sending out a second ship before the first one arrived to slaughter everybody. Athens made an example out of Mytilene, but it revealed far more about themselves. In a somewhat shocking twist of fate, other cities also had navies. Sparta's ally Corinth had an excellent fleet to their name, as did one of their colonies, Korkida. This island at the north end of the Ionian Sea was a major link between mainland Greece and the riches of southern Italy. So for centuries since its founding, Korkida was prosperous and functionally independent, resulting in a long-standing rivalry with their mother city. This came to a head in the 430s when Corinth tried to bring its former colony into line, but was repelled with help from Korkida's new best friend, Athens. This seemingly isolated incident on the other side of Greece had chaotic implications for mother cities and their many colonies, which inadvertently led right into the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Despite support for the Athenian alliance and the leading democratic faction, several oligarchs wished to buddy up with Corinth and Sparta. In 427, this diplomatic scheming devolved into open slaughter, with both factions killing whomever they could get their hands on. Sparta thought this opening might let them take the island, but Athenian reinforcements drove them off. Gorkyda remained in the Delian League and kept on sending ships, but they proved just how devastating it was to get caught between the empires. There had never been a Greek city as clever, powerful, or viciously glory-hungry as Athens, all of which combined to make a nearly pan-Hellenic state. And as we've seen, it took a lot more than just an Acropolis. At home, they played to their skills, resources, and geography, while in Greece at large, they leveraged diplomacy and pure exploitation to fuel their glory. That reckless, endless grasping would later be their ruin, but with a narrative this strategically intricate and flat-out dramatic, it's clear why Thucydides literally invented history just to keep us talking about it. The walls of ancient Sparta were said to be made not of brick, but of men, and like many things said about the Spartans, this is almost as cool as it is misleading. By the classical period, Sparta had earned a reputation for its brutal training program and singular focus on producing the best warriors possible. So women exercised rigorously to bear the strongest Spartans, and those boys began their training at age 7. The military machismo is palpable. Then, in 480, came their crowning achievement of defending Thermopylae to the death against Persia and ousting them for good the following year, and so the myth of Spartan excellence was set forever. Sparta's actual battle record is less impressive, but the badass fear no death vibe was enough to convince most of mainland Greece to join the winner's circle and ally with Sparta's Peloponnesian League. For a century and a half, Sparta was the dominant polis in Greece, defeating even the Athenian Empire in a 30-year war. But all this power and influence translated into shockingly little. By now, Spartans had long tired of artistry or literature and never cared for outside trade or shiny architecture. Sparta was and would remain 4 humble villages in a valley between the mountains of Laconia whose primary exports were pithy quotes and violence. So maybe they had no use for walls because of their buff hoplites and naturally defensive terrain, but perhaps Sparta's best armor was its glory. Now, if the Spartans spent all their time exercising, training, and flexing their muscles for the bros in the barracks, who was doing all of the farming to support their society? Ancient Greek sexism was a hell of a drug, but even Spartan women enjoyed many of the same privileges and leisures as male citizens. Instead, the Spartans handled the task of agriculture with slavery. Like, holy hell, so much slavery. See, just to the west of Laconia is the region of Messenia, and sometime in the late 700s, Sparta waged a multi-generational war to conquer Messenia and subjugate the entire population as helots, a whole class of people enslaved and owned communally by the Spartan state, laboring in the fields for centuries so the boys back home had more time to run laps and wrestle. From its earliest identifiable history, Spartan society was built to preserve this core dynamic of citizen leisure and helot servitude, and they remained utterly terrified that it might break. Unfortunately, Sparta's enemies were aware of this, so the city of Argos supported a helot uprising in the mid-600s to try and topple Sparta. It failed, but the lingering paranoia might have been the spark for Sparta's subsequent transformation into a military aristocracy, complete with a secret police designed to spy on and terrorize the helots. However frightening it must have been to go up against a classical-era Spartan phalanx, it had nothing on how scared they were about the Mycenaeans they'd enslaved. For all the scholarly debate about Sparta's actual strength in battle, 2 clear weaknesses are how they had no cavalry and they could barely sail to save their lives. But this is where the Peloponnesian League proved useful, as it allied Sparta to the second strongest naval power in Greece, the city of Corinth. Situated right at the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland and smack in between 2 seas, Corinth was a maritime heavyweight in trade, naval power, and colonization, with settlements spanning from Potidea to Korkyra to Syracuse. Throw in how Corinth was an actual city renowned across Greece for its beauty, and it was easily Sparta's crown jewel of the league, if they cared about that kind of thing. Naturally, Sparta really just wanted Corinth for their ships, because that was their only shot at standing up to the fleet of the Athenian Empire. Unfortunately for Sparta, 2 Corinthian colonies got into trouble with the mother city by allying with Athens, setting off the diplomatic fuse that would draw Sparta and Athens into their giant awful war. Even worse, Corinth's second best navy in Greece couldn't cut it against Athens, as they got clowned on at the Battle of Naupactus in 429. Sparta's only relief came in 407 when they got a massive pot of gold to fund a fleet and finally kick Athens' ass, courtesy of the Persians. A little scandalous, but Sparta was too pragmatic to let cultural sympathy override a good strategy. Some Greek cities seems destined to not exist. See, when war finally broke out between Athens and Sparta in 431 BC, the Spartans' plan for a quick and easy win was to besiege the city, burn the countryside, and either starve them out or bait them into a losing battle. But Athens had the naval convoys to keep the city well fed, and the restraints to not run outside their walls and get immediately flattened by a Spartan phalanx, or so they feared. So in 429, Sparta instead set out for nearby Plataea. It was the site of the final battle of the Persian Wars, and after its destruction, the Greeks rebuilt it and made it into a neutral sacred space in thanks for their role in the victory. However, Plataea was always being menaced by its bigger neighbor Thebes, so ever since 519, the Plataeans had a defense agreement with Athens. Now, when the big war got going a century after, Thebes took the occasion to live its truth and attack Plataea, sending in saboteurs and building giant ramps to scale the walls, but failing to breach the city before Sparta arrived in 429. The Plataeans tried to convince Sparta with appeals to their sacrifice and valor in the Persian War, but those rascally Lacedaemonians insisted Plataea had broken its sacred oath by being too cozy with Athens. So Sparta joined the siege, blockaded the city, and starved them out by 427. Easier to do when they didn't have a navy. While most Plataeans had escaped to the safety of Athens, Sparta smashed the city into pebbles, just as viciously as another invader had done some 50 years earlier. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to understanding Sparta is how little they ever explained themselves, so we're left with Athenian and later Roman accounts of the Spartans that exoticize and praise them to Thermopylae and back. But looking through their history, we see a pragmatic cruelty pervading their choices. Kill the Plataeans, they're too friendly with Athens. Ally with archenemy Persia to defeat Athens. Any boat money is good boat money. Enslave an entire population of helots to make them farm. It gives us more time to exercise. Beat your kids and leave them to starve. It'll train them into tougher soldiers. Sparta's cruelty was deliberate and calculated not just against its enemies, but imposed on itself. Spartans loved their leisure, yet also chose to make their lives harsher for the sake of their army and state. What strikes me about Sparta are these contrasts, like how individual Spartans have a blasé attitude towards death, be it in battle or childbirth, yet Sparta as a polis was ruled by fear of change, of foreigners and their ideas, of not being stronger than their enemies, and of the helots they enslaved. Sparta and Athens aren't mirror opposites, and they both cut a villainous figure in the Peloponnesian War, but more than any other civilization in the classical world, people's perceptions and praises of Sparta says a lot more about them and their values than it says about the boys in red. When we talk about ancient Greece, so much of that is filtered through the lens of Athens. Democracy was invented by Athens. The Persian Empire tried to conquer Greece, but was defeated by Athens. They tried again, but were locked out for good by Sparta and Athens. The first empire to span the Aegean Sea was created by Athens. The biggest war in ancient Greek history was fought between Sparta and Athens. The arts of philosophy, theater, and oratory were cultivated and hit their peak in Athens. Diogenes peed in the street and spit on rich people in Athens. Not as important as the others, but you see the trend. The tale of classical Greece at the height of its glory and impact on world history is essentially delineated by here's when it's the Athens show. From the creation of democracy in 508 BC to the defeat and conquest of Athens and its allies in 338 by the upstart kingdom of Macedonia. In the 400s, Athens was the capital of an empire, and in the 300s, it was the capital of Greek culture. Athens has more than earned its time in the spotlight of history. But right now, let's put someone else in the driver's seat. Frankly, anyone else. So, to understand classical Greece as more than the 170-year-long Athenian power hour, to instead zoom out and see the shape of the whole Greek world, them, Sparta, Thebes, Persia, and everyone caught in the middle, let's do some history. Now, while Athens is off gallivanting into empire and infamy in the 400s BC, what are we looking at instead? Fantastic question. I'm so glad I wrote it that way. Allow me to reframe the story of the classical period. We typically think of it as the century and a half when Greece gets bigger, grander, the height of excellence, but we can also trace this period as the failure of the polis system. Since the 700s, the essential unit of Greek civilization was the city-state, the polis, that self-sufficient combination of an urban core and its surrounding farmland. For 3 centuries, precious few governments in Greece were bigger than a city, and they didn't need to be. But when Persia came around, the world got real big, real fast. In 546, the Achaemenid Persian Empire conquered the cities of the Ionian coast, and there was precisely nothing any of them could do about it. They bristled under Persian authority and made themselves tricky to govern, even launching an open revolt in the 490s, but neither they nor their allies across the Aegean had the means to stand up to them. The cities were just too small. Persia recognized this and went over to one of those distant revolt enablers to teach them what for. Except, shock and surprise, Persia got their asses handed to them because, oh by the way, that was the Battle of Marathon. Just by the numbers, little old Athens should not have won that battle, so when it came time for round 2 a decade later, they needed more than some good battle tactics and another lucky break. Winning the Second Persian War and preventing Greece from getting squished into an imperial province took the combined effort of the most powerful militaries in Greece working together, which they had to that point never done on that scale. It's such a crucial chapter in Greek history because it was the first time they faced an existential threat. Sure, there's the danger of entire cities getting burned to the ground, which did indeed happen, but becoming subjects of Persia also meant overwriting the Greeks' identities as citizens of their polis. Even in victory against the Persians, that core danger would not go away forever, and any one city alone did not cut it. That's why so many cities were eager to ally with Athens or Sparta in a mutual defense league. In a world of big scary empires, try making one of your own. Athens' Delian League campaigned against Persia on and off in the following decades, including a brief foray into Egypt, but for the next 50-ish years, Greece was safe from outside invasion. But this of course brings us to the problem. After Bluetown and Redsville over here carved up mainland Greece and the Aegean, the primary threat switched from Persia to each other. An empire way over the sea is nowhere near as scary as one you can see just across the bay, and each team was willing to put the maximum squeeze on the cities beneath them to protect against the other. That'll blow up in a minute, but even before then, it was a raw deal for the small cities whose territory, manpower, and wealth supported those big empires, because their dearly cherished autonomy got flattened anyway. In 471, the island of Naxos tried to ditch the Athenians, but when Athens forcibly brought them back in line, everyone realized, oh, cool, this isn't an alliance, this is a protection racket. Got it. Other cities would try their luck excusing themselves from the party, but neither imperial master was allowing any of it. When war inevitably did erupt between Athens and Sparta, for the second time actually, it meant nearly 3 decades of conflict all across the Greek world. Now, Greeks were no stranger to killing and dying for their home polis, but the wars of centuries past were local and quick. This was a sustained, multi-decade slog with massive armies and navies all over Greece, fighting pitched battles and protracted sieges, all of which could only be supported by squeezing a vast amount of resources from allies and then burning it year after year after year on the war. While the immediate loser of this Peloponnesian War was Athens, everyone was worse off for it. Not just before and during the fighting, but long after the war as well. See, when Sparta finally bested Athens in 404 BC, it confiscated the Athenian Empire for itself and began collecting tribute from Athens' former subjects, sharing none of it with their long-suffering allies. Sparta promised an age of freedom, but what they actually did was monopolize imperial exploitation. Part of their strategy was to install military governors called harmosts in conquered cities, to prevent any of their subjects from taking an interest in that icky Athenian democracy. Yuck. Assuring their dominance by casually destroying the political fabric of Greece. The polis was no longer the essential unit of society or the vessel through which citizens expressed their identity, but an instrument of control for exploitative overlords. Far from returning to a comfy Polis Age equilibrium, the new normal after the Peloponnesian War was a game of hegemony. As we enter the 300s BC, one state alone was the biggest power in Greece. Notably, the exact outcome Greeks feared from Persia a century earlier and went to extreme lengths to avoid. But this new world order was not as rigidly monopolar as it appeared because Sparta's dominance would prove extremely fragile. Unfortunately for the boys in red, Greece was about to play a rousing game of Deck the Leader, where old rivals put aside their differences to absolutely clobber whomever was currently on top. Round 1 began with Sparta's allies Thebes and Corinth furious to be cut out of the victory spoils and willing to ally with anyone to get revenge. Not just their old adversary Athens, but existential enemy number 1, Persia. See, the Persians were thrilled to finance Greece's interstate slap fights and keep the heat off themselves. No need to conquer the Greeks so long as they were constantly squabbling. So when Athens started doing a little too well in the war, no trouble at all. Persia just switched allegiances, backed Sparta, and forced peace negotiations with everyone ending weaker than they started. In Persia's book, that's an absolute win, and that simple yet oh so effective playbook would continue working across the next 3 decades. Round 2 kicked off in 378 with 2 separate flashpoints. First was Athens recreating the Delian League by inviting its current and former allies back into the team, and second was Thebes successfully ousting the Spartan Harmost and his garrison from their city. Later that decade, in 371, Thebes accomplished the unthinkable by beating Sparta in a hoplite battle and then muscling into Sparta's own turf to put them in baby jail. Thebes liberated Sparta's enslaved population of Helots and gave them a city in their home region of Messenia, cleanly depriving the Spartans of their main source of agriculture and saddling them with a fiercely hostile city right next door. Several actually, as Thebes also organized an Arcadian League in the central Peloponnese to keep Sparta thoroughly boxed in from the north as well. That's an impressive turnaround, but Thebes is, looking pretty powerful right about now. Pretty threatening, I might say, if I were an Athenian. So, of course, round 3, Athens and Sparta versus Thebes, meeting at the Battle of Mantinea, which was the largest hoplite fight in Greek history and a rare double knockout, with Thebes losing its star general Epaminondas and Sparta losing most of its army. So here, in 362, all sides were utterly exhausted. No new hegemon could take the Thebans' place, and by the time there was one, this cycle would just repeat all over again, to the supreme delight of the Persians. From that perspective, this cycle seems endless, and the classical era overall looks to be a pretty dire stretch for those poor self-sabotaging Greeks. Don't worry, it was, but it's more than just a bad time. This era sees the step-by-step, agonizing obsolescence of the city-state, the force that organized and defined ancient Greek civilization up to this point. That's the tragedy hidden just beneath the Athenian Golden Age of the 400s, and that offers some key context for what comes next. 3 years after Mantinea, Philip II becomes king of Macedon and enjoys the luxury of conquering Greece at its absolute weakest. Still impressive, certainly, but far less of a surprise. That's one read on the situation, but there is another. This whole process started when the world around Greece got bigger. Persia was a big threat, so the Greeks created something bigger than the polis to meet it. Ouch times ensued, but by the death of Philip in 336, Greece for the first time found itself in the shape of an empire, a shape it would retain for 1500 years. The tragedy of the classical period is Greeks trying to preserve their civic way of life yet diving headlong into its undoing, so their culture had outlived their society, but the irony of the era is that culture actually outgrew society. See, the Golden Age of Athens in the 400s was plenty spiffy, but the 300s arguably outshine it, taking what Athens started, expanding on it, and spreading it so these accomplishments would last beyond the fortunes of whichever city was playing hegemon for a decade. This century is where we see the founding of entire schools of philosophy, the proliferation of history as a genre by Thucydides and Xenophon, the empirical study of political science, oratory as an art form in the speeches of Demosthenes, formalized medicine from Hippocrates, new comedy in the plays of Menander, plus plenty more pottery, sculpture, and architecture all across Greece. In the 300s BC, Hellenic culture was accelerating, so when the Macedonian Empire shows up and Alexander the Land Expander does his thing, Hellenism adapts seamlessly to the new shape and scope of the Greek world. I don't think it would have gone that smoothly if the polis were still as strong an institution and an identity as it was before. The atrophy of the polis left an undeniable void, but that posed an opportunity for a new kind of Hellenism to take its place. In this case, a bigger kind. So where does all that leave us? The classical period was a fleeting triumph for Athens and Sparta, a lasting tragedy for the polis, and a triumph in waiting for the Greek world that would follow. I'm not getting emotional, I just have an abiding love of civics. And clearly a lot to process. Don't mind me, just some marble dust in my eyes, nothing but a totally normal level of emotions about a society I've never lived in. It's fine, we're fine, I'm fine. Now, in one sense, it is actually fine, because that's not where the story of Greece ends. Contrary to Persia's hopes, it would continue on ever greater in scope, power, and influence, and in the exact plot of Athens' worst nightmare, it would do so without them in charge. But once Macedonia conquered Greece and remade the entire Near Eastern world in their image, that Aegean genie is quite thoroughly out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back. So histories of Alexander the Cliffhanger, the Ptolemies inbreeding in Egypt, the cultural coup of Roman civilization, the golden disaster that was the Byzantines, and tales of even further beyond will all have to wait for another day. So if Greek as a language and Greece as an idea continued for another 2,000 years into our present world, what sets their ancient history apart? What's so specific or special about ancient Greece that captures our historical imagination and stands as its own civilization? One could easily make the case for their ideas, the language and literature, the mythology, the invention of history, the poems, plays, and philosophies, the scientific inquiry, all the intangibles that comprise a culture. In this framing, the Archaic era has a spark of multi-talented brilliance on the coast of Ionia, which culminates in the myriad achievements of Athens during the Classical period. That is true, but it's a very narrow angle, so while all these ideas did become entwined in the thought of every Mediterranean civilization to follow, there's more to this puzzle. Descending then from the lofty realm of thought, we can also understand ancient Greece through their monuments, the cities they built, the architecture they filled them with, down to the sculpture and art which all defined the physical space of ancient Greece. And this all being a civilization-wide fashion sense, nearly every corner of the Greek world gets to demonstrate this, from the great sanctuaries of Ionia, to the statue of Zeus at Olympia, to the temple-filled cities of Magna Graecia, and everything in between. The Greek aesthetic is truly iconic. Now, each of them on their own are great, but what really nails the harmony is how these tangibles and intangibles fit together. This culture is so damn vivid that I can say the name Athena and you can likely conjure the myths, poems, and plays which gave her a character, as well as the statues, paintings, and grand temples that gave her a presence. Ideas take on form and monuments take on meaning, and both of these reinforce each other. That is unfathomably cool, and yet it is still not the whole story. Because looking at culture alone is essentially playing the hits, but there's also the human reality that history is made by people, and getting them to get along is a species-defining pain. So now, my biases on full display, we turn to the third angle of society. The governments they made for themselves, the oddball innovations like democracy, the colonies they founded across the Mediterranean, the way city-states competed for prestige and athletic glory, and of course the various ways they kicked each other's asses. All of these define the social ecosystem of Greece, and thus had the greatest bearing on the lived experience of the ancient Greeks themselves, which consequently is the part with all the harsh realities packed into it. So, let's put this all together. The combination of culture and society define ancient Greece as we've seen it so far. One of, in my humble estimation, the most enduringly fascinating and endlessly explorable histories on the planet. Of course, it did not emerge fully formed, and we've traced the development of this identity through Minoans and Mycenaeans, the Dark Age, the Archaic era within mainland Greece as well as beyond it, the rise of Athens, and the downfall of the polis system. While Greek culture only grew in scope and scale thanks to Alexander the Welcome to the Hellenistic period, the structure of Greek society would fundamentally change in that transformation. What came after was still Greece, is still Greece, but at different steps in the lineage of Greek identity, as capital A, ancient Greece, gave way to something new. Oh boy, I'm gonna have to make another one of these, aren't I? Oh no! What a nightmare! Thank you for watching. I know I love me a mega compilation, but I genuinely feel like something clicked in my brain when I put this all in sequence and threaded it together. So thank you for letting me indulge this feature-length hyperfixation. It'll be a while before we finish the entirety of Greek history, but we are at the very least more than halfway there. There is, therefore, plenty more where this came from, and I'll see you in the next one.